Introduction. I used to think Christmas was safe, not because of the lights or the music, but because it was predictable. Even when I was broke, even when work was cruelly busy, even when I didn't see my father for weeks, December moved along a railroad track of habits and dates. The first cold morning when my breath looked like it belonged to a stranger, the first overpriced tree propped outside every hardware store, the first day I could smell cinnamon from somebody else's apartment and feel my brain reach for a memory that wasn't even mine. That year, 2 Christmases ago, though it feels closer than yesterday, I picked up something I hadn't planned to, a relief job watching an older woman's house while her sister took her out of town. The house was old, quiet, and farther from the city center than the places I usually lived. It stood at a fork in the type of suburbia where everything looked normal until you noticed how few people were outside, and how the streets were too empty for the number of garages. The kind of place where every window had curtains, and the only sound at night was the click of a traffic light changing colors for no one. I'm not writing this because I want attention. I'm writing it because I can't keep carrying the feeling that I left something unfinished in that neighborhood, and because each December brings back the same physical reaction: the sudden pulse in my throat, the sweaty prickle in my palms, the odd knowledge of being observed without any clear proof. At first, there wasn't anything dramatic. There weren't screams in the night or footsteps in the attic. There weren't shadow figures standing under the lampposts or phone calls with breathing on the line. What there was is worse in a way, or harder to explain. Small, patient irregularities in something that was meant to be familiar. A holiday that always felt like a set of rules began to feel unruled. I had been seeing the same plastic reindeer on my walk to work for weeks, stapled to the yard of the brick house on the corner. I remember it because one antler was slightly bent back, as if it had bumped its head and never recovered. The owner would turn it on at dusk. The reindeer's internal bulbs flickered through its cheap mesh skin, and the white wires looked like bones. That reindeer became a marker for my day. I passed it at 7:40 in the morning, again at 5:15 in the evening. And then, on one cold afternoon, I passed the yard, and it was gone. Not packed away. Not broken and thrown aside. Just gone, the patch of lawn empty in a way that made my eyes snag. I don't know why I noticed that so hard. My brain wants cause and effect. It wants answers it can use. A neighbor probably moved it. It blew away. Someone borrowed it. It isn't supposed to matter. But when I got to Mrs. Dalka's house, the house I was watching, I found a plastic reindeer in the back garden, half hidden under a rhododendron bush. The same model, the same cheap mesh skin, the same bent antler. That's how it started. Not with fear exactly, but with a realization that things could travel without my permission from one part of my life into another. Like someone took my visual memory and placed it in a different room. The Dalkas' house had an address I'm not going to write here, not because I think anyone is going to go, but because it feels like that place has a right to stay unmarked. It was a brownstone with a stone front porch and 2 heavy planters on either side of the steps that weren't just decorative. They were unkindly large, as if meant to anchor the steps in place. The front door had thick wood grain you lost your fingers in when you rubbed it, and a brass knocker that was duller than it looked in photographs. The surface pitted like someone had tried to clean it with something too abrasive. Mrs. Dalka was not what I expected when I first met her. She was in her late 70s with small hands and a walk that looked deliberate, not frail. She had one of those voices people get after decades of not wasting breath, quiet but impossible to ignore. She kept the heat low and wore a wool cardigan inside the house, buttoned to the throat. She explained the job in short sentences, with no extras. I would stay overnight from December 21st through December 27th, water plants, and make sure the new furnace alarm didn't go off again. She couldn't be alone for a long stretch, so her sister would take her to stay with family, and I would keep the house from feeling abandoned. She showed me the places I'd sleep: a small guest room with a low bed and a faded quilt that still held the faint laundry smell of somebody else's soap. The window looked out over the back garden where the ground sloped down into darkness beyond the fence. She pointed out the locks on the back door, the chain on the front door, the basement stairwell with its own padlock. She was methodical. And then, as if it were one of the practical notes, she added, "Don't touch the attic door." She pointed up at a ceiling hatch in the hallway outside her bedroom. It was painted the same white as the ceiling, and if she hadn't lifted her chin to it, I might have noticed it as something ordinary and forgotten about it entirely. There was no sign underneath, no extra latch, only the thin shadow line where its edge cut the ceiling. I asked why instinctively, the same way you ask why you can't use someone else's mug, or why the faucet drips. I expected it to have a property reason. The ladder is unstable, the insulation is messy, old wires. She said, "It won't help you." That was all. Her stare held mine just long enough to make it feel less like advice and more like a boundary she was placing between me and a part of her home. Then her face changed back, the small muscles relaxing, and she showed me where the flashlights were kept and how to restart the furnace if needed. When I arrived on December 21st with my overnight bag, the neighborhood had that particular quiet that comes right before Christmas. Everything seemed temporarily paused. Workplaces had already emptied out. People were doing the last necessary shopping and then retreating. The air smelled like cold metal and baking bread. Only every few houses displayed lights, and those felt more like obligations than celebrations. One wreath, one string of blue LEDs, one inflatable Santa sagging against a fence. I let myself in with the key misses. Dalka had given me, closing the door carefully behind me until the deadbolt clicked. I felt that small release you get when the door is locked and you are indoors, alone with your breath and the familiar shape you've entered. Only it wasn't familiar. The house held its temperature like a stored secret. It was cooler than outside, as if the stone walls kept summer's absence inside their pores. The hallway scent was mild but distinct. Old wood, wool, faint dust, and the light sharpness of something cleaned recently with bleach. It wasn't unpleasant. It was just old enough to feel like it belonged to someone else's lungs. I set my bag in the guest room and walked through the rooms again, not because I needed to, but because some places ask for orientation, like they resist being known. All the furniture was heavy and low, as if chosen by someone who didn't like tall things looming over them. There were framed photos on mantels that had been dusted so carefully the glass looked like it could cut you. There were no holiday decorations inside. Not even a bowl of pine cones. The only sign of December was the faint draft at the edges of the windows and the small pile of mail on the entry table, rubber-banded and untouched. In the kitchen, a paper calendar hung on the wall. Its squares were filled with appointments in pencil. The last week of December was blank, except for one word written across the 25th, home. The letters pressed deep enough into the paper that they made a shallow ridge on the other side. I remember pausing with my hand on the fridge door, reading that word, feeling like I was standing in a room someone had just walked out of. Home. She'd written it and then left. As night settled, the house made its ordinary noises. Pipes cooled. The furnace clicked. Somewhere, wood contracted with a soft, tired sigh. I made tea and sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on, listening to the faint electrical hum of the street outside. At around 9, I got up to check the back doors and locks. The garden outside was a black rectangle. My reflection in the glass looked pale and slightly older than I felt. When I leaned closer, I could see my breath fogging the pane. That's when I noticed the reindeer again. It was not in the yard earlier. I would have seen it when I walked through. The garden is small, bordered by a low stone wall and a fence, and the rhododendron bush isn't thick enough to hide something larger than a cat. Yet there it was now, half in shadow, its mesh body catching just enough light from the kitchen to outline its shape. The bent antler was a darker line against the night. I stood still for a full minute, trying to reconstruct my day. I had arrived after dusk. I had been careful because I'd been given someone else's house to hold. I had looked into the garden. I had not seen it. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was irritation, like a system in my head had been mildly violated. Had Mrs. Dalka left it there and I'd missed it? Had the neighbor's decoration blown over the fence? The idea was absurd. It was a staked lawn ornament, not a loose object. But I needed an explanation that fit the world. I opened the back door, just enough for cold air to slice into the kitchen. The smell of damp earth came in, and something else too, faintly sour like leaves that have been wet too long. The reindeer did not move. It was not lit. Its wire frame was dark, and the cord trailed behind it into the bushes like a vein. I stepped out onto the stone patio in my socks and felt the chill of the stone through the thin fabric. The yard was silent. Not even the city's distant noise reached here. The houses seemed to absorb sound. I approached the reindeer and crouched beside it. The mesh skin had a thin layer of moisture on it, making it look almost alive, as if it had sweated. When I touched the bent antler, it flexed slightly and then returned to its wrong angle. There was no stake, no plug in the ground, no sign it had been planted here. It looked as if someone had carried it into the yard and placed it carefully under the bush. I followed the cord with my eyes. It disappeared into the rhododendron, but I could see enough to know it did not lead to an outlet. It was just a length of wire, cut off at the end, the plastic sheath blunt and smooth, as if trimmed with a tool. I remember a cold wave moving through my stomach, not like nausea, but like the body's quick preparation for something it doesn't understand. My skin tightened. I stood up and looked toward the fence. The fence was old wood, stained dark, with no gaps large enough for anything that size to come through unless someone lifted it over. The neighboring yard beyond was unlit. No one moved. No footsteps on gravel. No sound of a gate. I took the reindeer by its wire frame and lifted it. It was lighter than it should have been, like an empty cage. Water droplets fell from it, tapping the stone. I carried it into the kitchen and shut the door behind me, locking it with the deadbolt. I set the reindeer in the laundry room, out of sight, and stood there for a second with my hands shaking, not from cold, but from the strange intimacy of the object. How specific it was, how it matched the one from my route to work, how it had arrived without any clear path. A decoration intended for cheer turned into something intruding. I told myself not to build stories out of it. I told myself to sleep. I made myself check the front door chain again, even though it was already set. I brushed my teeth in the bathroom with the hallway light on, listening to my own movements. When I turned off the lights and lay down in the guest bed, the quilt smelled of detergent and something faintly old, like linen stored too long in a drawer. The room was colder than the rest of the house. The window glass held the night's chill. I stared at the ceiling, at the dim outline of the attic hatch down the hall that I could not see from here, but could picture anyway. Don't touch the attic door. It won't help you. Outside, something small clicked against the fence once, and then again, like a thin branch tapping wood. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I waited for sleep. It did not come easily. Each time I began to drift, my body jolted as if catching itself falling. At some point, I heard the furnace start up and then shut off too quickly. I listened harder, trying to separate ordinary house sounds from anything else, and in doing so, I made the silence heavier. Sometime after midnight, I realized I could hear a faint music. It was not loud. It was not even clear. It was a thread of melody that might have been a neighbor's television or a distant car radio, but it was too steady for that. It sounded like a Christmas song played on an instrument that couldn't hold the notes properly, like a child's toy piano, the kind with plastic keys that make each tone slightly wrong. The melody drifted up and down, stopping and starting, as if the person playing it was not aiming for the song so much as circling it. I lay still, counting the spaces between notes. I tried to locate it by direction, but the sound seemed to come from inside the walls, or from the floor beneath me, or from the air itself. Then it stopped. In the pause that followed, the house felt suddenly more empty than before, like a theater after the audience has left. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I waited for the melody to return, and when it didn't, I felt a tightness under my ribs that I couldn't name. I finally fell asleep in short pieces, waking each time with the same sensation, that someone had been standing just outside the room, close enough that the air would shift if they moved. When morning came, the first light was thin and gray. I got up with my jaw clenched from dreaming too hard and went straight to the laundry room to look at the reindeer. It was gone. There was no sign of it. No wet patches on the floor. No stray wire. The laundry room was exactly as I had left it. Detergent bottles lined in a row, a mop bucket, a folded towel. I opened the door to the backyard and looked under the rhododendron. Nothing. Only the dark earth, disturbed slightly, as if something had been pressed into it and then lifted away. I stood in the kitchen in the weak daylight, feeling the slow spread of a kind of disbelief that made my skin feel tight. I had not dreamed it. The reindeer had been in my hands. I had carried it. I had locked the door. I checked the front door chain. It was still latched. I made myself eat toast. I watched my own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The house felt politely quiet, as if it had done nothing unusual at all. By noon, I had convinced myself I must have misunderstood something. Maybe I'd placed it somewhere else. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe there had been a second reindeer, and this one was the neighbor's, and someone came for it in the night. Each explanation was thin, but my mind tried them on like clothes, searching for anything that fit without leaving me exposed. Still, when I left the house to go buy groceries for the week, I locked the door and stood on the porch for an extra moment, looking down the street. The brick house on the corner, where the original reindeer had stood, was decorated again. But it wasn't the same reindeer. It was a Santa sleigh, cheap and shining, propped at the edge of the lawn. And beside it, facing the street, was a wireframe reindeer with one bent antler, unlit, as if waiting for dusk. It looked, from that distance, exactly like the one that had been in Mrs. Dalka's garden. I walked away from the Dalkas' porch with my shoulders raised, the way you carry them when you don't want anyone to see you tense. I did not turn back until I reached the end of the block. When I finally did, the house's dark windows stared out without expression. I told myself it was coincidence. That was the last calm thought I had for days. Background. Before that week, I wasn't someone who chased strange stories. I didn't spend nights scrolling through videos about disappearances or arguing with strangers online about what was real. I liked explanations that had edges you could hold. If something broke, you found the reason. If someone acted badly, you looked for motive. Even when the truth was unpleasant, it was still a shape. I grew up in a cramped apartment above a mechanic shop. The building shook when trucks rolled over the potholes, and the stairwell always smelled like oil and old smoke. My mother measured safety in rituals. The deadbolt turned twice, the curtains pulled before dusk, the same route to school, the same small grocery store where the owner knew our faces. She didn't talk about superstition, but she believed in patterns. When a pattern broke, she got quiet and watchful. I learned early that a quiet watchfulness can be its own kind of panic, the kind that doesn't waste energy on noise. As an adult, I kept that practicality, sometimes to the point of being dull. I worked in a logistics office, the kind of job made of shipping times, delivery windows, and emails that always carried the same artificial politeness. Most days were numbers and small crises. My body lived in a low hum of stress that never became a single event. I lived alone in a third-floor flat with thin walls. My neighbors' lives leaked through, a baby crying at dawn, a television left on too loud, a couple arguing in a language I didn't speak. It was normal. It was human. It made the building feel full, which I preferred. December of that year hit me harder than usual. My company cut overtime without warning. A friend's wedding invitation arrived with a deadline for travel I couldn't afford. I had already bought a train ticket to visit my mother after New Year's, convinced I'd make it work, and then watched my balance drop in slow motion. One night I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment, phone glowing in my hands, doing anxious math and feeling my throat tighten with each subtraction. When my coworker Lydia mentioned her aunt needed someone to stay in the house over Christmas, it sounded less like an opportunity and more like a rope thrown down. Lydia didn't present it as something dramatic. She said it the way you mention a shift that needs covering. My aunt's going to stay with family over Christmas, she told me, stirring sugar into her coffee at our break table. She doesn't like leaving the house empty. She asked if I knew someone careful. The word careful made my ears perk. I said I could do it, and Lydia gave me a look that was half relief, half warning. She texted me an address and a time to meet her aunt the next day. I met Mrs. Dalka in a cafe near my office, late afternoon when the sky was already dim. She arrived early and sat with her hands folded around a small espresso cup that cooled untouched. She wore a dark wool coat buttoned high and a scarf wrapped tight enough to look like armor. Her hair was pinned back in a style that didn't allow stray strands. She looked small, but not fragile. Her eyes were pale and steady, the kind that make you feel as if you've been seen in full even if you've said very little. She didn't ask about my hobbies or my beliefs. She asked whether I smoked, whether I had anyone who might come by to visit, and whether I could stay there continuously. The questions weren't friendly or unfriendly. They were practical, like a person who had learned to remove uncertainty wherever possible. When I asked about payment, she named a number that loosened the knot in my stomach. Not a fortune. Just enough to turn the week into a solution instead of another stressor. She slid a spare key across the table with 2 fingers and said, "Lydia told me you're careful." I said, "I am." She nodded once, like that completed the agreement. A few days later, Lydia walked me to the house so I wouldn't show up cold. On the way, she told me small things about her aunt in an offhand way that felt rehearsed by habit. Mrs. Dalka had lived there for decades. Her husband had been gone a long time. There had been a son who moved away and didn't visit often. The sister taking her out of town was younger, louder. "The kind who laughs too loud," Lydia said, and then her voice dipped. "My aunt is particular." I laughed softly, expecting it to mean she liked things tidy. Lydia didn't laugh back. "Just follow her rules." The house itself wasn't the kind of place that begged for stories. It wasn't abandoned-looking or crumbling. It was maintained, but maintained in a way that didn't invite comfort. The front garden hedges were trimmed into clean lines. Gravel had been raked into neat patterns. The porch light worked. The windows were clean. Yet the building felt guarded, like someone kept their shoulders squared even inside their own skin. Inside, the air was too still. Not stale, just held. There were thick rugs over polished wooden floors, dull colors that absorbed light. The furniture was old but solid, heavy pieces that didn't wobble or creak. The rooms felt arranged to reduce surprises. Nothing was precarious. Nothing was playful. There were framed photos on mantels and shelves, but they were dusted so carefully the glass reflected like water. There were no Christmas decorations at all, not even a wreath. That absence registered because the neighborhood outside still carried December's signals in fragments. Strings of lights, a plastic Santa, a looping song from a shop radio. The Dalka house refused all of it. Mrs. Dalka showed me the locks like a person presenting a system. Front door deadbolt, chain, back door deadbolt and latch, basement padlock. Flashlights in the kitchen drawer. A list of emergency numbers taped by the phone. A furnace alarm reset sequence written in neat block letters. Then, in the hallway under a ceiling hatch painted the same white as the ceiling, she tipped her chin upward and said, "Don't touch the attic door." I looked where she indicated. The hatch's outline was only a thin shadow line. It could have been invisible if you weren't trained to notice. "Why?" I asked, in the same tone you ask why you can't use a certain burner or why a cupboard sticks. She didn't soften. "It won't help you." That was all. No story, no explanation. The way she said it made it feel less like a preference and more like a boundary, placed for a reason she didn't want to unpack. I didn't argue. In my life, I'd learned that older people sometimes hold pain in rooms you're not invited into. I assumed it was storage or memories or a hazard she didn't want to deal with. I filed it under respect. The week before the job started, I passed the Dalka house once in the evening while walking home from errands. I slowed without meaning to. The street was dim and quiet. In the upstairs front window, a thin strip of light glowed behind the curtain. It made the glass look warm against the cold outside. I remember thinking, she's still there. She's awake. Then, a shape moved behind the curtain, quick and close, like someone leaning toward the window and pulling back again. I didn't see a face. I didn't even see a whole body, just the change in light and the sense of proximity. It should have meant nothing. People move in their homes. But the movement didn't have the rhythm of someone crossing a room. It felt like someone checking, then withdrawing. I kept walking and told myself I was tired, my eyes filling in meaning where there was none. When December 21st came and I arrived with my bag, I was already worn down from work and the general December pressure. I'd left my own apartment with its familiar smell, detergent, coffee, my own life, and stepped into the Dalka house's colder, older air. That change alone made me feel slightly unmoored, like my body noticed the difference before my mind did. After the first night, after the reindeer appeared and then vanished by morning, I called Lydia. I didn't want to say it out loud because it sounded ridiculous. A decoration. A missing decoration. A noise in the night. Those are the things you mention and then hear your own voice and feel small. Lydia answered quickly, and I could hear voices behind her, a kitchen clatter, someone laughing. "Everything okay?" she asked, brisk, as if she could solve problems by naming them. I forced my voice steady. "Does your aunt put decorations in the back garden?" A pause, short but real. "No," she said. "She hates that stuff." "Hates it?" "She thinks it's noisy." Lydia lowered her voice. "She doesn't even put a tree up anymore." "Why?" Lydia exhaled like she didn't want to be responsible for what she was about to say. "She says it attracts people." The phrase made my skin tighten. "Attracts who?" "I don't know," Lydia said quickly. "She's old, she worries. She thinks if the house looks festive, someone will assume there are gifts inside. She's had packages stolen before. Just lock the doors, okay? Don't go outside at night. If you see something again, call me." Her explanation was practical, and I wanted to hold on to it because it kept the story human. People steal. People trespass. People do things for reasons that don't require anything beyond entitlement and boredom. But the reindeer's cut cord, the way it seemed placed rather than blown in, and the way it vanished from inside the house made that explanation feel thin. After the call, I walked through the rooms and checked every latch, every lock, every window. Not because I thought I'd find anything, but because my body needed action. I opened closets and stared at hanging coats. I pulled back curtains. I checked under beds. I told myself it was responsible, but it was fear wearing responsibility's clothes. Without meaning to, I ended up under the attic hatch again. I stood there and stared up. The ceiling was higher in that hallway, and the hatch's rectangle looked like a deliberate blank. I did not reach for it, but while I stood there, I noticed a faint scuff mark on the wall beneath it, the kind you get when a ladder scrapes paint. It wasn't fresh, but the paint around it was rubbed smooth as if something had pressed there repeatedly. Someone had used a ladder there. Of course they had. Attics exist for access. But Mrs. Dalka's warning changed what that scuff mark meant. It turned it from ordinary wear into evidence of a boundary that mattered. That evening, I focused on mundane tasks, the way you focus on your breathing when you don't want to spiral. I watered the houseplants. A cactus on a windowsill, a thick-leafed plant in the living room, a fern in the bathroom that looked like it had been stubbornly kept alive. I wiped the kitchen counter. I folded blankets on the sofa. I did normal things to convince my nervous system I was in a normal situation. When dusk arrived, the streetlights outside clicked on, and the inside shadows deepened. I turned on lamps, creating warm pockets of light that made the hallways feel darker by contrast. I ate soup standing at the counter because sitting felt too still. I watched the back garden through the glass whenever I lifted the spoon. The yard stayed empty, a black square framed by the window. When I finally went to bed, I locked the guest room door. Mrs. Dalka hadn't suggested it. The lock was an old one, a simple button in the knob that clicked into place. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it gave me a small illusion of control. Sleep came in fragments. I woke once to a sound like something sliding softly along wood, too long to be a single step, too light to be furniture. I held my breath until my lungs hurt. The sound stopped. Then the house returned to its careful stillness. In the morning, I repeated my new mantra: old house, normal noises. I told myself I was manufacturing tension because I was alone in someone else's quiet space. But when I went downstairs, I saw something on the living room rug that dissolved that comfort. A small cluster of glitter, silver and blue, caught the light near the edge of the coffee table. It wasn't scattered widely like craft glitter. It was compact, like it had been pressed into the fibers and then rubbed loose. It looked like residue from a decoration dragged across the rug. I knelt and touched it. The glitter clung to my fingertip immediately, cold and sharp against my skin. I rubbed it between my fingers and felt the tiny grains resist, abrasive like sand. I didn't have glitter in my bag. The house had no decorations, yet the glitter was there, a trace that didn't belong. I stood up slowly, and for a moment the room felt subtly different, not in light or furniture, but in my understanding. The boundary between inside and outside, between private and exposed, had shifted. Someone had been in the house while I slept, and they had left just enough behind for me to know it. Not enough for proof, just enough for certainty. First, irregularities. Once the idea took hold that someone else might have been inside the house, everything ordinary began to feel provisional, like it could be revoked at any moment. I moved through the rooms more slowly, listening to the sound of my own steps as if they were giving something away. The house didn't respond. It didn't creak more than before or shift in protest. It stayed calm in a way that felt deliberate. I vacuumed the glitter. I told myself I was erasing a mistake in perception, not evidence. Still, when I emptied the canister into the trash, I saw the fine shimmer against the dark dust and lint and felt a tightening behind my eyes, a pressure that felt like anger turned inward. I tied the bag and took it out to the bin immediately, even though it was cold enough that my breath came out sharp and white. I didn't want it in the house. The rest of the day passed without anything dramatic happening, which somehow made it worse. The mind looks for peaks and valleys. When nothing happens, it fills the space with anticipation. I checked the locks more often than necessary. I flinched at the furnace starting. I kept thinking I heard something just behind me, a soft displacement of air, and turning to find nothing. In the late afternoon, while the light outside was already thinning, I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a thread woven into the house's usual scent. Something sweet but wrong, like overripe fruit or candy left in a warm car. It didn't belong to any specific room. It seemed to exist in the hallway more than anywhere else, thin and persistent, like a memory you can't place. I walked from room to room, nose lifted, trying to track it. The kitchen smelled of soap and metal. The living room smelled of dust and wool. The guest room smelled like detergent and old fabric. But when I stepped into the hallway under the attic hatch, the sweetness was there again, slightly stronger. It made the back of my throat itch. I stood under the hatch and stared up, my skin prickling. The attic door was flush with the ceiling, its edges painted over again and again until the line between door and plaster blurred. There was no handle visible from below, only the scuff mark on the wall and the faint, sweet smell in the air. Don't touch the attic door. I took a step back as if the ceiling might lean down toward me. The smell didn't intensify. It stayed exactly the same, like a held breath. That night, the music came back. It started earlier this time, just after 10, when I was sitting on the edge of the bed scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. The first note was so soft I thought it was in my head. Then another, and another, forming the wrong outline of a familiar Christmas melody. The notes were uneven, some lingering too long, others clipped short, as if the instrument or the hands playing it couldn't agree on tempo. I sat very still. The sound didn't seem to come from outside. It wasn't muffled the way distant music usually is. It was clearer than that, as if it were being played somewhere inside the structure of the house itself. The vibration felt faintly in my chest, a physical thing. I checked my phone to make sure no app was playing. The screen was dark. No notifications. No sound. The melody stumbled through the first few bars, then stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note. The silence afterward felt thicker, like something had been removed and left a vacuum behind. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. The music didn't return. I slept badly, waking with my heart racing, my mouth dry. At some point I dreamed of standing in a narrow space, walls pressing close, the air too sweet to breathe properly. I woke with the smell still in my nose and had to sit up and gulp air like I'd been underwater. The third day was December 23rd. In the morning, I found the back door unlocked. I know it had been locked. I had checked it before bed, my hand on the deadbolt, my eyes on the metal. Now the bolt was slid back, the handle cold under my fingers. The door was closed, but it opened easily when I pushed. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean compared to the house's held warmth. The garden lay quiet and empty. No reindeer, no footprints that I could see, though the ground was hard with cold and wouldn't have held them anyway. I stood there with the door open, my heart beating too fast, my thoughts scrambling. Someone had unlocked it from the inside, or they had a key, or I had made a mistake. I locked it again and stood with my back against the door for a long moment, feeling the solid wood through my spine, trying to ground myself in the physical fact of it. I called Lydia again. This time she didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was lower, distracted. "Hey, I'm in the middle of something. I think someone's been in the house," I said. I didn't soften it. I didn't laugh it off. Saying it plainly made my hands shake. A pause. I heard her step away from whatever noise had been behind her. "What do you mean?" "I found glitter on the rug. Decorations that don't belong. The back door was unlocked this morning." "You're sure you locked it?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "My aunt would have said something if someone was coming by." "Does anyone else have a key?" "Just me." "And my aunt." She hesitated. "And maybe my cousin years ago. But he moved." "Could your aunt have come back?" "No," Lydia said quickly. "She's hours away." "Look, are you safe right now?" "I think so." "Then don't go outside. Keep the doors locked. I'll come by tomorrow morning, okay? We'll look together." "Tomorrow?" The word felt heavy. "I can't tonight," she said, and I could hear the strain in her voice now. "Just stay put." After the call, the house felt smaller, as if the walls had moved inward by a few inches. I kept imagining the moment the door unlocked, the quiet click of metal, the careful turn of a handle. Someone inside the house while I slept, moving with enough familiarity not to make noise. I tried to distract myself with chores, but every task felt hollow. I ate without appetite. I watched the windows as dusk fell, the glass turning into dark mirrors. My reflection looked thinner, stretched by fear. That evening, I noticed something new. The mail pile on the entry table had been disturbed. I was certain I hadn't touched it since arriving. Mrs. Dalka had left it neatly rubber-banded, envelopes aligned. Now the rubber band lay beside the stack, stretched and twisted, and the envelopes were fanned slightly, as if someone had flipped through them and then tried to put them back the way they were. My name was not on any of them. They were all addressed to Mrs. Dalka, her name written in various hands, printed, typed, stamped. Someone had handled them anyway. I stood there staring at the mail, a slow chill spreading through me. This wasn't theft. Nothing was missing. It was inspection. Interest. That night I did not sleep at all. I sat in the guest room with the light on, my phone charged, my shoes on my feet. Every small sound made my muscles jump. The house seemed to breathe around me, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, with unseen movements of air. At around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps. They were soft, careful, and slow. Not the random creak of settling wood. Not the pop of pipes. They had rhythm. Weight. They moved along the hallway outside the guest room door. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might give me away. The doorknob did not turn. The footsteps paused, just outside, close enough that I could almost imagine a shadow under the door. Then, very slowly, they moved away toward the center of the house. Toward the hallway, toward the attic hatch. I sat frozen, listening until the sound disappeared entirely. I did not follow. I did not move until dawn's gray light crept under the door and softened the shapes in the room. When morning came, I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been scooped from my chest. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The attic hatch was no longer flush with the ceiling. One corner hung slightly lower than the others, just enough to cast a deeper shadow, just enough to tell me it had been opened. Escalating tension. I stood beneath the attic hatch for a long time, my neck craned back, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The shift was subtle. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have missed it. One corner sagged lower, creating a hairline gap between the door and the ceiling. The paint along that edge was cracked. The thin fissure darkened as if something inside had pressed against it from below. The smell was stronger now. The sweetness I'd noticed before had thickened, layered with something else, dry, dusty, and faintly metallic. It reminded me of old decorations pulled from boxes after years of storage, mixed with the smell of insulation and stale air. It made my stomach roll. I did not touch the hatch. I stepped back instead, my heel bumping softly against the wall, and felt a tremor move through my legs that had nothing to do with cold. My body wanted distance. My mind wanted confirmation. Those two impulses fought each other in silence. Lydia arrived late that morning, later than she'd said. By the time her car pulled up outside, I had already gone through the house twice, documenting changes in my head like a crime scene I wasn't qualified to process. The back door was still locked. The attic hatch remained crooked. Nothing else had been disturbed. That almost felt intentional, as if whatever had happened was meant to be noticed and nothing more. When I opened the front door for her, relief hit me so hard my vision blurred for a second. She looked tired, her hair pulled back hastily, her coat half-buttoned. She stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold, her expression shifting as if she felt it too. The house's held breath, the quiet pressure. "You look awful," she said. "I didn't sleep," I replied. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and tight. She walked through the rooms with me, checking doors, windows, the garden. She crouched by the rug where the glitter had been and frowned at the vacuum lines, as if she could still see it there. She stood under the attic hatch and stared up. "That's not right," she said finally. "You see it," I said. It came out sharper than I intended. "Yes," she said slowly. "It's supposed to sit flush." "Has your aunt ever gone up there?" I asked. Lydia's mouth tightened. "Not in years." "Who has?" She hesitated. "Her husband used to. Before." "Before what?" "Before he died." She rubbed her arms as if suddenly cold. "Look, she told you not to touch it, right?" "Yes." "She told me the same thing when I was a kid," Lydia said. "I thought it was just old house stuff. Secrets. You know? Does anyone live up there?" The question escaped before I could stop it. She stared at me. "What? I hear things," I said. "At night. Footsteps. Music." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, then back to me. "There's no one living there." "But someone's been in the house?" "Maybe," she said, too quickly. "Maybe someone broke in. Maybe they were scared off." "Unlocked the door from the inside?" I asked. She didn't answer that. We stood there, the silence thickening between us. Finally, she said, "I'll talk to my aunt. I'll ask her about the attic." "When?" "Today," she said. "I promise." "Can you stay?" I asked. The question felt raw, exposed. "I can't," she said. "I have to go back. But listen to me." She took my hands, her grip firm. "If anything else happens, anything, you leave. Don't argue. Don't try to be brave. Just go." She left less than an hour later. The house swallowed her absence immediately. That afternoon, snow began to fall. It was light at first, thin flakes drifting lazily, barely touching the ground before melting into dark, wet spots. By evening it thickened, the flakes larger, heavier, muting the street sounds until the world outside the windows looked padded, unreal. The streetlights glowed softly, halos diffused through white. Snow should have made me feel safer. It meant footprints. It meant visibility. Instead, it made me feel sealed in, as if the house and everything in it had been wrapped and set aside. As dusk settled, the music returned. This time it was louder. I was in the kitchen when the first note sounded, sharp enough that I dropped the glass I was holding. It shattered on the tile, the sound too loud in the enclosed space. I froze, listening. The melody was clearer now, unmistakable. A Christmas carol, one I'd heard since childhood but warped. Notes dragging, others skipped entirely, the tune stumbling like someone half remembering it. The sound vibrated faintly through the cabinets, through the floor. It was coming from above, from the attic. I stood there, my breath shallow, my heart racing so hard it made my ears ring. The smell thickened again, sweet and suffocating, filling my mouth. I tasted it at the back of my tongue. The music stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, something scraped. It was slow, deliberate, like wood against wood. Then another scrape, closer to the edge of the ceiling. I backed away until my shoulders hit the fridge, the cold metal grounding me just enough to keep me upright. The attic hatch creaked, not opening, just shifting, the sound of pressure being applied and released, testing. I imagined fingers on the edge of the door, nails pressing into painted wood. I fled to the guest room and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly I fumbled the lock twice. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, my phone clutched in my hand, the screen lit but useless. I didn't call Lydia. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I would say. Above me, something moved. The sound traveled slowly across the ceiling, a careful redistribution of weight. It paused, then moved again. Each shift made fine dust sift down, tiny grains catching the light as they fell. I watched them settle on the quilt on my sleeve. I pressed my hands over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The movement stopped directly above the guest room. For a long time, nothing happened. Then very softly, I heard breathing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't gasping. It was controlled, measured, as if whoever or whatever was breathing was listening as much as I was. The sound traveled through the thin barrier of ceiling and insulation, intimate and horrifying in its proximity. I don't know how long it lasted. Time stretched into something viscous and unreliable. My muscles burned from holding still. Tears ran down my temples into my hair, cold against my skin. Eventually, the breathing faded. The weight shifted away, retreating, and then there was only the sound of the house settling and the snow brushing against the windows. I stayed where I was until morning. When dawn came, pale and exhausted, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The attic hatch hung open, not wide, just enough to reveal darkness beyond, thick and absolute. The ladder had been pulled down halfway, its wooden rungs worn smooth, dust clinging to them like frost. Something had come down, and it hadn't finished. Critical incident, I didn't scream. That fact has bothered me more than almost anything else. Later, when I replayed it, I wondered if not screaming meant I had accepted something on a level deeper than thought, if my body understood before my mind did that noise would only make things worse. The ladder stopped just above the floor, suspended as if whoever had lowered it decided not to commit to the final step. It swayed slightly, a slow pendulum motion that made the wood creak with each shift. Dust drifted down in a steady fall, catching in my hair, settling on my shoulders, filling the air with that sweet, rotting smell until it felt thick enough to choke on. I stood at the end of the hallway, barefoot on the cold floor, my body locked somewhere between flight and collapse. The darkness above the hatch wasn't empty. It wasn't the absence of light. It felt occupied, dense, like a held mass. A sound came from inside the attic. Not footsteps this time. Not music. Dragging. It was the sound of something being pulled across a rough surface, slow and uneven. Wood scraping against wood. Fabric catching and tearing free. The movement was careful, unhurried, as if time did not matter to whatever was up there. I took one step back. The dragging stopped. I froze, every nerve in my body flaring hot and sharp. The silence that followed was so complete it rang in my ears. Then, from just above the ladder, a shape shifted. At first I couldn't understand what I was seeing. My brain tried to interpret it as shadow, as trick of angle and low light. But the shape resolved slowly, deliberately, as if allowing itself to be seen. A hand appeared over the edge of the hatch. It was not gloved. It was not skeletal. It was human enough to be wrong, skin pale and stretched tight, veins standing out dark beneath it. The fingers were too long, the joints thickened, the nails uneven and cracked, rimmed with dark grime. They gripped the edge of the door frame with familiarity, like hands that had done this many times before. I felt my bladder spasm with fear. The hand tightened, knuckles whitening, and then another appeared beside it. Both hands braced, testing weight. The ladder creaked in response, wood complaining softly under pressure. Something leaned forward into the light. I saw hair first, thin, gray-white, hanging in lank strands that brushed the ladder rungs. Then a forehead, deeply lined, skin mottled with age, and something else, something unhealthy. A face followed, emerging inch by inch. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His eyes were open too wide, the whites yellowed, the pupils small and sharp as if adapted to darkness. His mouth hung slightly open, lips cracked, teeth visible behind them. The smell intensified as his head cleared the hatch, sweet and rotten and unmistakably human decay, masked under old fabric and dust. He did not look surprised to see me. That was the worst part. His gaze slid over me slowly, assessing the way you look at an object to determine its use. His head tilted just slightly, and I heard a faint click in his throat like dry joints shifting. For a moment, an awful, intimate moment, I thought of Mrs. Dalka's photographs, the careful dusting, the absence of her husband from every frame I could remember. The man's lips moved. He tried to speak. What came out was a wet, broken sound, breath catching around words that no longer fit together. His jaw worked, muscles straining with remembered motion. "Home," he rasped. The word scraped its way out of him, raw and wrong. Something inside me snapped. I ran. I didn't think about shoes or my bag or the cold. I ran down the hallway, my feet slapping the floor, my lungs burning as if I'd been submerged too long. Behind me, the ladder creaked violently as weight shifted fast, careless now. Wood cracked. Something heavy hit the floor. I heard him laugh. It was not loud. It was breathy, broken, and full of a terrible relief. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, my fingers numb and clumsy. The deadbolt felt stuck, resistant, as if the house itself hesitated. Behind me, I heard dragging again, faster this time, punctuated by wet, hitching breaths. The smell was everywhere. The lock finally gave. I yanked the door open and stumbled onto the porch, the cold air slamming into me like a physical blow. Snow swirled under the streetlight, pristine and unreal. I did not look back. I ran barefoot into the street, screaming now, the sound tearing out of me without shape or control. Lights flicked on in neighboring houses. Doors opened. Someone shouted. I collapsed in the snow at the edge of the road, my body giving up all at once, shaking so hard my teeth cracked together. Hands grabbed me, voices layered over each other, confused, alarmed. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the Dalka house's front door. It was still open. And in the shadowed hallway beyond, just visible between flickering lights and falling snow, a figure stood perfectly still, watching. Aftermath. I woke up in a hospital room that smelled aggressively clean, the kind of sterile scent that feels like it's scrubbing your thoughts as well as your skin. The lights were too bright, even through my closed eyelids. My throat burned. My mouth tasted like metal and old cotton. For several long seconds, I didn't know where I was. My body felt disconnected, heavy in places and strangely absent in others. Then memory came back not as a sequence, but as a physical impact. Cold air, the sound of my own screaming, the smell, the face in the attic. My heart rate spiked so suddenly the monitor beside the bed began to beat faster. I opened my eyes and immediately regretted it. The room tilted. White walls, a curtain half drawn, a chair with my coat draped over it. My coat. That detail grounded me enough not to spiral completely. A nurse came in, her movements efficient, but not unkind. She told me to slow my breathing. She told me I was safe. She told me I'd been found outside in the snow, barefoot, incoherent, with mild hypothermia and severe dehydration. She told me I'd lost consciousness on the way to the hospital. I asked about the house. She exchanged a look with someone outside the curtain before answering. "The police went to the address you gave," she said carefully. "They didn't find anyone inside." The words felt unreal, like they belonged to a different story. "The attic," I said. My voice cracked immediately. "Did they check the attic?" She hesitated. "Yes. And?" She chose her words with the precision of someone trained to deliver bad news in manageable pieces. "They found signs that someone had been living up there. Old bedding, food wrappers, personal items." My stomach dropped. "They also found human remains." The room seemed to shrink around that sentence. She explained that the remains were skeletal, old, incomplete. The police believed they belonged to Mrs. Dalka's husband, reported deceased decades earlier. Officially, he'd been declared dead after a disappearance that was never fully resolved. There had been no body then. Now there was part of one. I asked about the man I'd seen. I described him in broken phrases, my hands shaking so badly the nurse had to hold them still. She listened, her expression neutral but strained. There was no living person found, she said gently. No one matching that description. I stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Lydia came once. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red. She held my hand and cried without making any sound, tears dropping onto the blanket in dark spots. "My aunt won't talk," she said finally, voice hollow. "She keeps saying the house was never empty, that it was never abandoned." I asked what that meant. Lydia shook her head. "She says some people don't leave when they're supposed to. She says Christmas makes them restless. Mrs. Dalka never visited me. The police took my statement twice. Once while I was still medicated enough that the memory felt like it belonged to someone else, and once after I was discharged, when the details came back sharper, crueler. They asked careful questions. They took notes. They exchanged looks they thought I didn't notice. Officially, the explanation settled on trespassing, delusion induced by stress, and a tragic misunderstanding layered over a long, unsolved death. The attic, they said, had likely been used by transients at different points. The remains explained the smell. The decorations could have been scavenged. The music could have been auditory hallucination. None of it explained how the attic hatch had been opened from the inside while I slept. None of it explained the reindeer. None of it explained the way he had looked at me with recognition. I didn't go back to the Dalka house. I didn't retrieve my bag. Lydia mailed it to me weeks later without a return address. Some things were missing. I didn't ask which ones. I quit my job in January. Not dramatically. I just stopped being able to sit in enclosed spaces without feeling the ceiling press down on me. I moved to a smaller place with high ceilings and no attic access. I sleep with lights on. I avoid silence. Every December, something changes in the air. It's not just the cold. It's not just the music in stores or the decorations appearing overnight. It's the sense that something is being invited back, quietly, politely, by habit alone. Sometimes, late at night, when the city noise thins, I swear I can hear it again. Not clearly, not enough to prove anything. A broken melody, circling a song it almost remembers. And every time my body reacts before my mind does. Because some places don't stay empty. And some things don't understand that Christmas is supposed to mean home for the living only. Story 2. It waited for Christmas to come upstairs. Introduction. I hadn't been to my grandmother's house for Christmas in years. Not since I was old enough to decide where I spent my holidays and young enough to believe that decisions were clean things. Life got busy in the boring adult way. Trains needed catching. Rent needed paying. I learned to let December pass like weather, something you notice, complain about, and move through. 1 week before Christmas, my mother called and said Grandma's heating had been acting up again, and she didn't want her staying alone through the cold nights. My mother's voice had that practiced steadiness she uses when she's trying not to admit fear. "Just go for a few days," she said. "Make sure she's eating. Make sure the radiators are working. Keep her company." I agreed too quickly, partly because it sounded simple, partly because guilt is efficient. I told myself it was only a short visit, that I'd sit by the tree, drink tea, and sleep in my old room like I did as a kid. I packed a small bag with thick socks and a sweater that still smelled faintly like detergent from my apartment. I boarded the afternoon train with commuters carrying paper bags and tired faces. Outside the window, the fields looked rinsed clean of color, winter flattening everything into gray. My grandmother's house sits in a village that is technically connected to the city, but feels like it exists on a different calendar. The train station is a low building with a single bench and a schedule posted behind cloudy plastic. You step off the platform and the air immediately changes, colder, sharper, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The streets are narrow, the sidewalks uneven. People decorate, but in a restrained way. One paper star in a window, a wreath on a door, a short string of yellow lights that blinks too slowly to feel cheerful. It was already dark when I walked the last stretch toward her street. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the cold had that pre-snow pressure, the kind that makes the sky look heavy even when it's clear. My breath came out in short white clouds that vanished quickly, like the air didn't want to hold on to anything. Her house is older than I am, older than my mother, probably older than my grandmother's memories of it. Stone walls, a pitched roof, and a gate that always catches on the same loose flagstone. The garden used to feel huge when I was a child. Now it looked small and strict, hedges cut into hard lines, the ground dark and bare. In the front window, a single lamp glowed behind thin lace curtains. The light didn't spill out. It stayed inside as if it were being kept. Grandma opened the door before I knocked. That should have felt warm, like she'd been watching for me. Instead, it made my skin tighten, because it meant she'd been standing close enough to hear me approach over the gravel, close enough that she could time the latch. When the door swung inward, I was hit by the familiar smell of her house: boiled vegetables, wool, old wood, and that faint medicinal note of menthol rub she uses on her wrists. "You're thin," she said, as if that was the only greeting she trusted. "I'm fine," I told her and stepped inside. The hallway was exactly the way I remembered it, and also not. Same framed family photos, same umbrella stand, same small table with a crocheted runner. But the air felt cooler, held. It wasn't the comfortable cool of an old house conserving heat. It was a coolness that seemed to come from inside the walls, like something damp had settled there and never dried. My shoulders lifted without permission. Grandma's movements were slower than I expected. Not frail, but careful, as if she measured the world before stepping into it. She wore her usual dark cardigan, buttoned high, and slippers that whispered against the floor. Her hair was pinned back tight. Her eyes looked pale in the lamplight, and when she looked at me, it felt like she was checking that I was fully present, that I hadn't left parts of myself on the journey. She asked if I was hungry. She asked if the train was late. Ordinary questions. But she didn't ask how long I'd stay. She didn't say she was glad I came. She acted as if my arrival was something that had to happen, something scheduled by a clock neither of us could see. I put my bag in the room that used to be mine. The bed had a different blanket now, a heavy quilted one that smelled faintly of lavender sachets and something older underneath, like fabric stored too long in a closed drawer. The window looked out over the back garden. In the dark, the glass reflected the room more than it showed outside. My own face hovering over the outline of furniture, my eyes too bright, my expression already strained. Downstairs, Grandma had set out a simple dinner: soup, bread, sliced cheese. The kitchen tiles were cold under my socks. The radiator in the corner ticked as it warmed, a thin metallic sound that should have been comforting. Instead, I found myself listening to its rhythm as if it were trying to communicate something. We ate with the television on low volume, a holiday program full of cheerful music and people in bright sweaters. The sound felt out of place in that kitchen, like someone had carried it in from another house by mistake. Grandma didn't watch the screen. She watched the window above the sink, where the darkness pressed close. Every time a car passed on the road behind the house, its headlights would slide briefly across the glass, and Grandma's gaze would follow the moving light, then return to stillness. After dinner, she showed me the boiler closet and the thermostat, the way older people do when they've been alone with their systems too long and want someone else to share the knowledge. She pointed out where she kept candles, where the flashlights were, and where the spare key lived, not on a hook, but taped under a drawer lip in the sideboard, hidden in a way that made my stomach sink. I didn't ask why. When she finished, she stood in the hallway and looked toward the stairs, her mouth pressed into a line. "Don't go into the back room," she said. I blinked. "What back room?" She nodded toward the door at the end of the hall, the one that leads to what we always called the sewing room. I remember that room as warm and cluttered, with baskets of yarn and old patterns. As a kid, I used to sit on the floor in there and look through buttons like they were treasure. I hadn't thought about it in years. "It's locked," Grandma added. "Why is it locked?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes didn't move from the door. "It makes noise," she said finally. I waited for her to clarify. When she didn't, I forced a laugh out of habit, trying to turn it into something harmless. Old houses make noise. She looked at me then. Her face didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. "Not like that," she said. The conversation ended there, not with an argument, but with a boundary placed cleanly between us. Grandma turned away and went into the living room as if she hadn't said anything strange at all. That night, I unpacked slowly, making small, unnecessary adjustments, folding my clothes into the dresser, lining my phone charger along the baseboard, because order is one of the few things you can control in someone else's house. I brushed my teeth in the bathroom where the mirror always fogs too quickly. I listened to the pipes groan softly as water ran through them, the sound familiar and yet too loud in the quiet. When I finally got into bed, the cold came up through the mattress like a slow tide. The quilt was heavy. It pressed down on my chest enough that I had to take deeper breaths. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a dry, steady certainty. I counted the ticks without meaning to, letting them pace my heartbeat. Then, after midnight, something changed. It was subtle at first, an absence more than a sound. The ticking seemed farther away, muffled, as if a door had been closed between me and the clock. The air in the room felt thicker. I sat up and listened. From downstairs came a faint, rhythmic scrape. Not the random creak of settling wood, not the hiss of radiators. A scrape, pause, scrape, like something being moved carefully across the floor. I told myself it was Grandma, awake, dragging a chair, maybe restless. I told myself she was adjusting something, making tea. I listened for her footsteps, for the quiet cough she sometimes has. Nothing followed the scrape. The sound moved slowly toward the back of the house, toward the sewing room. My mouth went dry. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my feet cold on the wood. The hallway outside my room was dark, except for a thin strip of light coming up from the living room below. I moved to the top of the stairs and held the banister, feeling the smooth, worn wood under my palm. The scrape happened again, louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from a door rubbing against something, opening and closing by a fraction, again and again, as if tested. At the bottom of the stairs, the hallway was in shadow. The sewing room door at the end was barely visible, a darker rectangle. I watched it, eyes straining. For a moment I thought I saw movement, just a slight shift in darkness along the edge, like the door had flexed. Then the air moved. Cold, damp, carrying a faint sweet smell I couldn't place, something like stale candy and wet cloth. I stepped back from the stairs, my skin prickling. I didn't call out to Grandma. The idea of speaking into that darkness felt wrong in a way my body understood before my mind could justify it. I returned to bed and lay down fully clothed, the quilt still heavy, my heart beating too fast. I stared at the ceiling and waited for the scrape again. It didn't come. Instead, much later, when I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard something else. So quiet it could have been my own pulse. A thin, childlike Christmas melody, a few wrong notes in the dark, drifting up through the floorboards as if the house itself was remembering a song it didn't want to sing. I held my breath until my chest ached. In the silence that followed, I became aware of one more detail, the faint, steady pressure of being observed, not from the window, not from the hallway, but from somewhere inside the house, as if the walls had eyes and I had just stepped into their line of sight. And that was the first night. Nothing happened in the way people mean when they want a story. No crash, no scream, no sudden revelation. Just the slow, bodily certainty that something in my grandmother's house had been waiting for Christmas, and that my arrival had not been a comfort to it, only a confirmation. Background. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was the kind of person people described as strong because it saved them from having to describe the harder parts. She had a way of surviving that looked like control. Her cupboards were arranged by use, not by beauty. Her bills were paid the day they arrived. Her voice stayed level even when she was angry, which meant you only noticed she was angry after it was too late to fix whatever caused it. When I was a child, that house had felt like a sealed world. It was always a few degrees colder than the outside in summer and warmer than the outside in winter, as if it ran on a different system than the rest of the village. The stone walls held onto heat and sound. When you closed the front door, you could hear the latch settle, and then the outside disappeared. Cars, voices, dogs, all muffled into a distant, harmless blur. I used to like that feeling. I used to think it meant safety. The house was built before central heating, before modern wiring, before the idea that a home should be easy. My grandfather, my mother's father, kept it running through a series of fixes that were always halfway between ingenuity and stubbornness. There were pipes that didn't match any blueprint, switches that controlled lights in rooms you wouldn't expect, a fuse box that sat behind a framed picture, like a secret. He could repair anything with a screwdriver and a look that said you were stupid for doubting he would. He died when I was 11. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He got smaller over months, then smaller over weeks, then simply wasn't there. I remember the smell in the house during the funeral week. Flowers going soft, damp coats hung too close together, the bitter coffee my grandmother kept making for people who didn't deserve it. I remember my grandmother standing in the kitchen with her hands in soapy water, staring at nothing, and I remember thinking she looked like someone who had been hollowed out and still kept walking. After he died, the house changed in small ways. Not enough to call it haunted. Just enough that I stopped running freely from room to room. The hallway seemed longer at night. The back garden looked darker. The sewing room became less of a play space and more of a place adults disappeared into and came out quiet. My grandmother started closing doors she used to leave open. She installed locks that weren't necessary for a village where everyone knew everyone. When I asked her why, she would say, "Because." Christmas in that house was always restrained. My mother would try to bring color, wrapping paper, garlands, cheap lights, but my grandmother didn't like clutter. She would allow a small tree in the living room corner, nothing tall enough to touch the ceiling, and she would insist the ornaments be the old ones, glass balls wrapped in tissue, a wooden angel with chipped paint, a single strand of lights that buzzed faintly when you plugged it in. There were never inflatables outside, never blinking displays. The only thing my grandmother would put in the front window was a single candle, the kind that looks like a flame but is really a bulb. She said it was so the house didn't look asleep. The last Christmas I spent there before this one was when I was 16. I remember it because it was the year my grandmother stopped inviting relatives. My mother and I arrived with groceries and gifts, and that forced holiday brightness people use to cover fatigue. The house was quiet. The tree was up but undecorated, just a green shape in the corner. My grandmother moved through the kitchen like she was alone even with us there. She kept checking the back door lock. Late that night, I woke to my mother's voice in the hallway. She was whispering into the phone, angry and scared at the same time. I opened my bedroom door a crack and saw her standing beneath the ceiling light with her arms folded tight across her chest. She noticed me and stopped speaking immediately. She waited until the call ended, then pushed me back into my room without saying anything, her palm firm on my shoulder. The next morning, my mother told me we were leaving early. She said Grandma wasn't feeling well. She said the roads might ice over. She said it was better to be home. None of it made sense, but I'd learned by then that adults sometimes make decisions for reasons they won't name. We didn't come back the next year, or the year after. My grandmother visited my mother once, briefly, in the city. She stayed one night and slept with the lamp on. I remember waking to use the bathroom and seeing her sitting on the edge of the guest bed, fully dressed, staring at the corner where the ceiling met the wall. When I asked if she was okay, she said, "Go back to sleep," in the same tone she used for weather reports. As I got older, the story of my grandmother became smaller in my mind. She was just an old woman in an old house. The village was just a quiet place where nothing happened. My mother stopped mentioning the house except in practical terms. The roof needed checking, the boiler needed service, the pipes froze if you didn't keep the heat up. My grandmother stopped calling much at all. When she did, she would ask if I was eating properly, then hang up. So when my mother asked me to go, It didn't feel like walking into a legend. It felt like returning to a neglected obligation. But on the train, as the city slid away and the landscape flattened into winter fields, I kept thinking about that early departure when I was 16. I kept thinking about my mother's whispering phone call and the way she'd physically moved me away from the hallway, as if she was protecting me from hearing something. I tried to remember what I'd heard that night. At the time, I'd assumed it was family drama, money, inheritance, my grandmother's stubbornness. Now, with my first night back already sitting in my body like a bruise, my mind wanted to revisit it with adult eyes. When I arrived and my grandmother opened the door before I knocked, it clicked into place that she had been watching for me. Not in the excited way grandparents watch for grandchildren. In the wary way someone watches for a delivery they cannot avoid. And when she told me not to go into the back room, the sewing room, I realized I had never actually seen that room in recent years. My childhood memory of buttons and yarn belonged to a different era of the house. Somewhere between then and now, that door had become something else. After the first night's scraping sound, I went downstairs in the morning pretending it was nothing. I moved carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb whatever held the house together. The kitchen looked the same, clean counters, the same faded dish towels, the kettle sitting exactly where it belonged. My grandmother stood at the sink peeling potatoes with a small knife, her hands steady, the peel falling in one long spiral. "Did you sleep?" she asked without looking at me. I hesitated. "Not great. I thought I heard you up." Her knife stopped for half a second. Then it continued, shaving the potato skin as if nothing had happened. "I sleep," she said. "When I can." Did you go into the hall last night?" I asked. She set the potato down and turned her head slowly toward me. Her face didn't change, but her eyes sharpened again, the same way they had when she warned me about the back room. "You don't need to worry about sounds," she said. "I'm not worried," I lied, feeling heat rise under my collar. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked past me toward the hallway, her slippers whispering. She stopped at the sewing room door without opening it. She placed her palm flat against the wood as if checking for warmth or movement. Then she withdrew her hand quickly and returned to the kitchen. "The house moves," she said quietly. "That's all." Her tone ended the conversation. She poured tea into 2 cups with a precision that made the steam look controlled. She slid 1 cup toward me without meeting my eyes. I drank, and the tea tasted normal, black, slightly bitter. But I couldn't stop smelling that faint, sweet note underneath, like something left too long in a closed space. It clung to the back of my throat. The rest of that day, I tried to treat the visit like I had promised my mother I would. I checked the radiators. I bled air from one that gurgled. I carried firewood from the shed because the boiler was old, and my grandmother liked the stove lit as backup. I did chores I remembered from childhood, and the familiarity should have grounded me. Instead, it made the house's differences stand out. The back hallway light bulb was new and brighter than the others, as if replaced recently after repeated use. The sewing room door had a newer lock than I remembered, the metal shiny against older wood. The keyhole was clean, no dust in it, which meant it was used. In the afternoon, I took a walk to buy groceries, mostly as an excuse to be outside in open air. The village streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own footsteps sound rude. A few houses had lights in their windows. A few had wreaths. People nodded at me with that slow, rural curiosity, the recognition of someone who belongs here only by history. At the small grocery, the owner, a man who had known my grandfather, asked how Grandma was doing. His smile was polite but uneasy, and his eyes lingered on my face longer than necessary. "She keeps to herself," he said, weighing apples. "Better that way." "Why?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged with one shoulder. "Old folks get strange," he said, but his tone didn't match the words. It carried a warning he didn't want to articulate. Then he added, "You staying the night there?" "Yes." He looked down at the scale. "Lock up," he said, "even in a village." When I walked back toward the house with grocery bags cutting into my fingers, the sky was already dimming. I passed the church, its stone dark with moisture, and I heard faint singing from inside, choir rehearsal or a recording. The melody drifted out into the cold air, warm and familiar in a way that should have comforted me. But the moment I heard it, my stomach tightened, because it reminded me of the thin, wrong notes I'd heard after midnight. Like the house had been trying to mimic a Christmas sound and failing. I reached my grandmother's gate and saw that the lace curtain in the front window had shifted. It wasn't much, just an inch pulled aside, enough to create a vertical line of darkness behind it. Then it moved again, as if someone's hand had released it. Grandma opened the door before I could lift my hand to knock. And as I stepped inside with the cold still clinging to my coat, I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that whatever I'd heard in the night hadn't been random house noise at all. It had been the sound of a boundary being tested, and my grandmother had known exactly when I would come back through the gate. First, irregularities. That evening, the house settled into itself earlier than it should have. By 6, darkness had pressed fully against the windows, flattening the outside world into black glass. Snow still hadn't come, but the cold sharpened, slipping in through seams I didn't remember existing. Even with the stove lit and the radiators ticking, my fingers felt stiff, like the warmth wasn't reaching all the way into the rooms. Grandma moved through her routines without variation. She cooked. She washed up. She wiped the counters until they were dry enough to squeak under the cloth. She did everything in the same order she always had, as if deviation might cause something to notice. I tried to mirror her calm. I read for a while in the living room, the lamp casting a low yellow circle on the page. The television stayed off. Grandma said the noise confused the evenings. The grandfather clock marked time with its steady tick, each second landing too clearly in the silence. The smell came back while I was reading. At first it was so faint I thought it was my imagination, a trace of sweetness layered under the usual house scents. Not pleasant, not sharp, just there. It reminded me of candy left in a pocket too long, mixed with damp wool. I lowered the book and inhaled slowly through my nose, trying to locate it. The living room smelled normal. Old upholstery, dust, wood polish. The kitchen smelled like potatoes and soap. But when I stepped into the hallway, the sweetness thickened slightly, just enough to make the back of my throat itch. It was strongest near the sewing room door. The door itself looked unchanged at a glance. Same off-white paint, same faint scratches near the handle from decades of use. But standing close, I noticed details that hadn't registered before. The door frame was cleaner than the surrounding wall, as if it had been wiped often. The floorboards in front of it were more worn, their finish dulled by repeated foot traffic. Someone stood there a lot. I bent slightly and looked at the keyhole. The metal around it was warm. I straightened too quickly, my head spinning for a second. Heat could have transferred from the house, from a radiator, from my own presence. I told myself all of that, even as my pulse thudded uncomfortably in my ears. Behind me, the clock ticked. I went back into the living room and sat down again, forcing my eyes back to the page. The words blurred. My attention kept snagging on small sounds, the whisper of Grandma's slippers in the kitchen, the faint creak of the ceiling above us, the occasional pop from the stove. Everything ordinary felt amplified, as if my body was bracing for something else to break through. When Grandma joined me, she sat in her chair and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't knit. She didn't read. She stared at the wall across from her, where an old photograph of my grandparents hung slightly crooked. The frame glass caught the lamplight, reflecting the room back at itself. "You don't have to stay up," she said after a while. "I'm fine," I replied. She nodded, as if she hadn't expected a different answer. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the hallway, then returned to stillness. At 10, she announced she was going to bed. She checked the back door lock twice. She slid the bolt on the front door and tugged it to make sure it held. She paused at the sewing room door again, her hand hovering inches from the handle before dropping back to her side. "Good night," she said. "Good night." Her bedroom door closed softly upstairs. I waited for the sound of her bed creaking, for the bathroom light to click off. When the house settled again, I turned off the living room lamp and climbed the stairs. In my room, the cold was sharper. I changed into sleep clothes quickly, my fingers clumsy, and got into bed. The quilt pressed down on me with familiar weight. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house's rhythm, the clock below, the distant hum of pipes, the faint whistle of wind around the eaves. Sleep came slowly, thin and fragile. Sometime after midnight, I woke with the distinct sensation that something had shifted. Not a noise, exactly. More like the absence of one. The ticking of the clock felt farther away again, muffled as if wrapped in cloth. I held my breath and listened. From downstairs came a soft, repetitive sound. A gentle thud followed by a scrape. Thud. Scrape. The pattern was careful, unhurried. It reminded me of someone moving something heavy in small increments, resting between efforts. I sat up, the quilt sliding off my shoulders. The room felt colder than before, the air thick enough that my skin prickled. The sound continued. It wasn't coming from the center of the house this time. It was coming from the back, from the sewing room. My mouth went dry. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my feet protesting against the cold floor. I opened my bedroom door a crack and peered into the hallway. Darkness pooled along the stairs. The faint glow from the grandfather clock face barely reached the bottom step. The sewing room door was visible at the end of the hall, its outline just discernible against the deeper shadow beyond. The thud scrape paused. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door moved. Not opening. Not closing. Just a slight flex inward, as if pressure had been applied from the other side and released. The wood gave a quiet complaint, a sound too controlled to be accidental. My heart slammed hard enough that I had to grip the door frame to stay steady. The smell surged then, stronger than before, sweet and damp, layered with something metallic that made my stomach twist. It flowed up the stairs like cold air. I retreated into my room and closed the door silently, my hands shaking. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Downstairs, the sound resumed. Thud, scrape, thud. Then faintly, something else joined it. A breath. Slow. Measured. Not the wheeze of old lungs. Not the rush of air through pipes. A deliberate inhale and exhale, close enough that I could almost feel the rhythm of it through the floor. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my knees drawn up to my chest. My skin crawled with the certainty that whatever was making that sound was aware of me, that it had registered my movement, my presence, and had simply continued anyway. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. I waited for footsteps, for the scrape to return, for Grandma to call out. None of it happened. The house held its breath with me. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me into a shallow, fractured sleep. I dreamed of doors that bent inward under unseen pressure, of rooms shrinking by inches while I stood inside them. Morning came gray and late. I woke with my jaw clenched, my muscles sore as if I'd been bracing all night. The house was quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. Downstairs, the kitchen light was on. Grandma stood at the stove when I entered, stirring oatmeal. She didn't turn around immediately. "You were up," she said. It wasn't a question. "I heard noise," I said carefully. "From the back room." Her spoon paused, then continued its slow circle. "The house settles at night." That wasn't settling. She turned then, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw fear move openly across her face. Not panic. Recognition. "You stay out of that hallway at night," she said. "Do you hear me?" "What is in there?" I asked. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. "Nothing you need to see." The smell lingered in the kitchen, faint but undeniable. I realized then that the sewing room wasn't just locked. It was being used. Escalating tension. The days that followed slipped out of order, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the same unease stretched across them without release. Time in my grandmother's house stopped behaving like time. Mornings arrived late and gray, evenings closed in too early, and the hours between felt padded like soundproofing around my thoughts. After that second night, Grandma changed her habits. She began waking before dawn. I knew because I would hear her moving downstairs while the sky outside my window was still black. Not loudly, carefully. The faint click of the kettle, the soft brush of slippers against tile, the low murmur of the radio turned down so far it sounded like someone speaking through a wall. When I came down later, the kitchen would already be cleaned, the counters dry, the trash taken out to the bin by the gate. She stopped leaving the sewing room door unattended. Before, it had been closed, but passive, just another boundary. Now she checked it the way she checked the doors, hand on the handle, a slight pull, a pause. Sometimes she pressed her ear against it for a few seconds before moving away. When she thought I wasn't watching, she also stopped going upstairs after dark. Once the light outside faded, she remained in the living room, sitting in her chair with her cardigan wrapped tighter around her, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. When she did speak, it was only about practical things, whether I'd eaten enough, whether the radiators sounded right, whether the weather forecast mentioned snow. I tried to leave the house during the day as much as possible. Long walks through the village, unnecessary grocery trips, standing in the cold air just to feel space around me. But every time I returned, the same feeling crept back in, the sense that the house had noticed my absence and was marking my return. On the third afternoon, I found the sewing room door unlocked. It was a small thing. The handle turned easily under my fingers when I brushed against it, passing down the hall. I froze, my heart stuttering. The door didn't swing open on its own. It stayed closed, perfectly still, as if daring me to confirm what I already knew. I didn't open it. Instead, I backed away slowly and went into the kitchen, my pulse loud in my ears. Grandma stood at the counter, slicing carrots. I watched her hands, steady and precise. "The sewing room was unlocked," I said. Her knife slipped. Just a fraction. Enough that the blade scraped against the cutting board with a sharp sound that made us both flinch. "It shouldn't be," she said too quickly. "Did you go in there?" "No." "Then who did?" She didn't answer. She turned the carrot and continued slicing, the rhythm slightly off now. I waited, my chest tight, but she said nothing more. That night I locked my bedroom door. It was an old lock, the kind that only works if you turn the knob just right. I tested it twice, pressing my shoulder against the door until it held. I left the lamp on and lay on my side, facing the wall, trying not to imagine the rest of the house behind me. Sleep came in fragments. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the smell. It was stronger than it had ever been. Sweet, heavy damp. It filled my mouth and nose, clinging to my breath. I gagged slightly and sat up, my eyes watering. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock had stopped. I listened, my heart pounding, straining for any sound that would place me back in the ordinary world. Pipes, wind, anything. There was nothing. The silence felt deliberate, like something had been muted. Then from downstairs I heard it. Not the scrape this time. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. One step, then another, each one placed carefully, as if whoever was walking was learning the floor as they went. The sound moved along the hallway, past the bottom of the stairs, toward the sewing room. I sat frozen on the bed, my hands gripping the quilt so tightly my fingers hurt. I wanted to call out to Grandma to break the silence, but something in me knew that would be a mistake. The footsteps weren't loud. They weren't rushed. They had no urgency. They sounded like someone who belonged there. A soft click followed, the sewing room door opening. The smell surged, rolling up the stairs like a physical thing. My stomach twisted. I pressed my fist against my mouth to keep from making a sound. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard the sound of fabric. Not ripping, not tearing. The soft, intimate sound of cloth being handled. Shifted. Folded. Dragged across another surface. It reminded me too clearly of my childhood memory of that room. Yarn sliding, patterns being stacked. The familiarity made my skin crawl. A low sound followed, not quite a voice. More like air being pushed through a space that wasn't meant to shape it. I slid off the bed and crouched by the door, my ear inches from the wood. The hallway beyond was dark, but I felt certain that if I opened the door even a crack, I would see something I couldn't take back. The sound continued for several minutes. Then it stopped. The silence afterward felt wrong, as if the house were waiting. Eventually, footsteps returned. Slower now. Heavier. They moved away from the sewing room, down the hall, and then, impossibly, up the stairs. My breath caught painfully in my chest. The steps creaked under weight, each one closer than the last. My body went cold, every muscle locked, every instinct screaming at me to disappear. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I stared at the wood grain, at the faint shadow beneath the doorframe. I could smell the sweetness stronger here, layered with something older, something like damp earth and old clothes. There was a pause. Then the handle turned, just slightly. Enough to test. The lock held. On the other side of the door, something breathed. Slow. Curious. Close enough that the thin wood between us felt like paper. I don't know how long it stayed there. Time lost all shape. I only know that eventually the pressure on the handle eased, and the footsteps retreated, one careful step at a time, back down the stairs. I didn't move until morning. When I came downstairs, Grandma was already awake. The clock was ticking again. The smell lingered faintly, clinging to the hallway like a residue. She looked at my face and knew. "It came upstairs," she said quietly. I nodded. She closed her eyes for a moment, her shoulders sagging just enough to reveal how much effort she'd been using to stay upright. When she opened them again, there was resignation there, heavy and old. "It's getting closer," she said. "To what?" I asked. She looked toward the sewing room door, then at me. "To remembering." That was the first time she acknowledged that whatever was in that room wasn't just noise, and it was the moment I understood that staying through Christmas hadn't been an accident. Critical incident. Christmas Eve arrived under a sky so low it felt like it was pressing the village into the ground. Snow finally fell, not gently, but in dense, wet sheets that soaked through coats and turned the roads into slick, dark mirrors. The world outside the house blurred into white and gray, as if distance itself had been erased. The isolation that had been creeping in for days became complete. Inside, the house felt different from the moment I woke. Not louder, not more active, just alert, like a body that had been asleep too long and had finally shifted into wakefulness. Grandma was already up. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded around a mug she wasn't drinking from. The radio was off. The clock ticked too loudly. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway. "It won't wait anymore," she said without looking at me. My stomach dropped. "What won't?" She took a slow breath through her nose. "It knows the date." The way she said it made the word date feel physical, like a weight pressing against the house. I sat across from her, the cold chair seeping through my clothes. "What is it?" I asked. I had been asking versions of that question for days, but now it came out flat, stripped of hope. She shook her head once. "I don't have a name that helps." I waited. The silence stretched. Finally, she stood and motioned for me to follow. She didn't take me toward the sewing room. Instead, she opened a narrow cupboard in the hallway that I'd always assumed held cleaning supplies. Inside, behind a stack of folded linens, was a small door set into the wall. I had never seen it before. The paint around its edges was cracked, rubbed smooth by use. "This used to be part of the house," she said, "before they closed it." She opened the door. A shallow crawl space yawned behind it, lined with rough stone. The air that came out was cold and sweet in the same wrong way I'd been smelling all week. "He started using this when your grandfather got sick," she said quietly. "Said it was easier than the stairs." My throat tightened. "Who is he?" Her jaw clenched. "Someone who didn't leave when he was supposed to." She closed the small door again and locked it with a key she pulled from her pocket. Her hand shook as she did. "All you need to know," she said, "is that it stays in the back room. It always has, as long as the door stays closed." "And when it doesn't?" I asked. She met my eyes then, and for the first time, I saw something like apology there. "Then it looks for family." The rest of the day passed in a suspended state that felt unreal. Grandma cooked dinner early, too early, simple food, eaten in silence. She lit the single candle in the front window, even though it was still light outside. She checked every lock twice, then a third time. By dusk, the snow had piled high enough that the gate was half buried. The village was silent. No cars, no footsteps, no voices. The house felt like the only structure left standing in a blank world. Grandma refused to go upstairs. She brought a blanket into the living room and sat in her chair, rigid, eyes fixed on the hallway. I sat on the couch opposite her, my muscles tight, my skin buzzing with the constant expectation of movement. At exactly 11:47, the clock stopped. Not slowly. Not with a stutter. 1 second it ticked. The next it didn't. The sudden absence of sound was like a blow to the chest. The smell surged immediately, thick and suffocating, rolling through the house in a warm wave that made my eyes sting. Grandma inhaled sharply and pressed her lips together. "It's open," she said. From the hallway came a slow, deliberate sound. The sewing room door unlocking. Metal turned against metal with careful patience. The door opened an inch. Then another. Something dragged across the floor. Not furniture. Not fabric. A heavier sound. Wet. Uneven. I stood despite myself. Grandma reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she whispered. "It knows you now." The dragging sound stopped. Then footsteps began, not toward the stairs, toward us. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if whoever or whatever was walking was savoring the distance. The smell grew unbearable, layered with cold air and something unmistakably human underneath. A shape filled the hallway. At first it was just darkness against darkness. Then it moved forward into the lamplight, and my mind refused to assemble what my eyes were giving it. A man-shaped outline, too thin, too bent, clothing that looked like it had been worn for decades without being removed, fabric hanging stiff and misshapen. Its head tilted as it saw us. When it smiled, something inside me broke. It knew us. Not just as people, as kin. Grandma made a sound then, not a scream, but a low, wounded noise that seemed to pull the thing's attention fully onto her. It took a step closer. I yanked my wrist free and moved without thinking. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove and swung it blindly, not at the thing, but at the lamp. The room plunged into darkness. Grandma screamed my name. In the chaos that followed, I heard the thing move fast for the first time. Not careful anymore. Excited. I felt air rush past my face, smelled rot and cold breath inches from my skin. I ran. I don't remember opening the front door. I remember snow, blinding and sharp, and the sensation of my lungs burning as I forced air into them. I heard something hit the doorframe behind me, heard wood crack. I didn't look back. I ran into the snow until my legs gave out and the world tipped sideways, white swallowing everything. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was my grandmother's voice, clear and steady despite the terror, saying a name I had never heard before. Aftermath, I came back in pieces. At first there was only cold and pressure, the hard sting of snow against my cheek, the taste of iron in my mouth, the tightness in my lungs as if someone had wrapped a belt around my ribs. I opened my eyes to a white blur and a sky the color of wet paper. Snow fell straight down, thick and quiet, landing on my eyelashes and melting into my skin. I tried to sit up and my body refused, not from injury exactly, but from exhaustion so complete it felt like gravity had doubled. A shape moved above me. A voice said my name once, then again, closer. I recognized my mother before I could understand why she was there. Her face hovered over mine, pale and furious and terrified, hair damp from snow, eyes too wide. "How—" I tried to speak, and the word collapsed into a cough. "Don't," she said, and pressed her gloved hand to my chest as if she could keep my ribs from tearing apart. "Breathe. Just breathe." I could hear other voices around us, neighbors or volunteers, the kind of small village crowd that appears when something breaks the routine. Boots shifted in snow. Someone asked if I was bleeding. Someone else said the roads were blocked, but the doctor was coming. My mother's breath shook in front of her mouth. "Where is she?" she kept saying. Not to me, not to anyone in particular. "Where is she?" I turned my head, slow and stiff, and tried to look back toward the house. From where I lay, the lane was a white tunnel, hedges softened by snow, fences reduced to faint lines. The house itself was a dark mass at the end, windows dim. The front door was shut. The porch light was on, a weak yellow dot in the storm. It looked calm, almost polite, as if nothing had happened inside it at all. I tried to tell my mother that Grandma was still in there. I tried to tell her about the hallway shape, about the smell, about the clock stopping. My mouth couldn't form it. My tongue felt thick. Every time I pushed for words, nausea rose like a wave. My body was doing something older than language, something purely physical. Survive, don't explain. They carried me to the neighbor's house first, because the ambulance couldn't reach the lane. I remember the heat hitting my face when the door opened, the smell of stew, the shock of normal domestic noise, pots clinking, a radio playing quietly, as if I had been pulled out of a sealed space and thrown back into the everyday world without transition. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. Someone pressed a warm mug into my hands. My fingers wouldn't close properly. I held it anyway, the heat burning into my palms like proof that I still existed. My mother stood by the window the whole time, looking out into the snow with a rigid stillness that scared me more than her panic would have. Her jaw was clenched so hard, a muscle jumped near her cheekbone. Every few seconds, she wiped her eyes with the back of her glove and left a wet streak across her skin. When the ambulance finally came, its light smeared blue and red across the snow like spilled ink. The paramedics asked me questions. My name, my age, where I was hurt. I answered what I could. My mother answered the rest. They put an oxygen mask over my face, and the plastic smelled faintly of rubber and disinfectant. The air it delivered was cold and metallic. I stared at the ceiling of the ambulance and listened to the siren fade in and out as we moved slowly through blocked roads. In the hospital, everything was too bright. Fluorescent light, white walls, the constant soft beep of a monitor. My clothes were cut off and replaced with a thin gown that made me feel exposed. My feet burned as they warmed, pins and needles stabbing through numb skin. A nurse told me I was mildly hypothermic and dehydrated. A doctor asked if I had hit my head. They took blood. They asked if I had been drinking. I shook my head. They asked why I had been outside in the snow. I said I had to leave. The words sounded ridiculous out loud in that clean room. The doctor's face stayed neutral, but I saw the flicker of interpretation, the mental file he chose to open. Panic attack, confusion, a fall, stress. He asked if my grandmother was safe. I turned my head to my mother. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the floor, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "They're with her," she said, voice flat. "People are with her." It took hours before anyone would say more than that. In that time, my mind kept returning to the moment the lamp shattered, the room dropping into darkness, the rush of something fast and eager, the way the smell filled my nose so completely I felt I could never breathe clean air again. I slept in short, broken bursts. Each time I woke, the hospital room took a second to assemble itself. Curtain, IV line, plastic cup, the faint hiss of oxygen in the wall. And each time, my body jolted with the same thought: Grandma. Late in the evening, my mother finally spoke in full sentences. "She's alive," she said first, as if giving me the only thing she could. "She was on the floor in the living room when they got in. The window candle was still on." My chest tightened. "Did she—" I couldn't finish. My mother stared at the wall for a long moment. "She won't talk," she said. "Not to them. Not to me." Was the back room open?" My mother's eyes flicked toward me, sharp. "You don't ask that. I need to know." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "The sewing room door was open," she admitted. "Just open, like it had been for a while. There were tracks in the dust on the floor, drag marks, and inside—" My mother didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands. The silence stretched long enough that my skin began to itch with it. "Nothing that makes sense," she said finally. "It was mostly empty. No sewing things. No baskets. Just old sheets, a mattress on the floor, and a smell they couldn't get out of the air." My pulse sped up. "Did they find anyone?" She shook her head once. "No, the word should have relieved me. It didn't." It opened a space in my mind that felt colder than any explanation. My mother leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Listen to me," she said. "Whatever you think you saw, you don't repeat it to people in that village. They already have their stories. They don't need yours. Do you understand?" I stared at her, suddenly seeing her as a child of that house, not just my mother. Her fear wasn't only for me. It was for the fact of the family itself, the way certain things get buried and then protected by silence. "What are their stories?" I asked. My mother's face tightened. "That your grandfather never left," she said. "That he died in the house and she hid it because she couldn't bear the shame. That someone in the family went wrong. That the house has a bad room." I felt my stomach turn. "Did you know?" My mother closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was exhaustion there so deep it looked like age. "I knew enough not to sleep there after dark," she said. "I knew enough to leave early that year. I knew enough to tell myself it was just old people getting strange. And Grandma?" My mother's jaw clenched. "She made deals with herself," she said. "She kept doors shut. She kept routines. She kept the candle in the window so the house wouldn't look asleep." My throat went tight. "You sent me there." Tears gathered in her eyes, then fell without sound. "I thought you'd be safe because you weren't alone," she said. "I thought—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her palm hard against her mouth as if to hold the words in. For a moment, the hospital room felt like the hallway in Grandma's house. Quiet, held, full of things unspoken. I stayed in the hospital one night. The next morning, the snow had eased, and my mother signed papers and brought me home to her apartment in the city. I didn't go back to my grandmother's house. I didn't collect my bag. I didn't step through that gate again. My mother said the village doctor told Grandma to stay with relatives for a while. Grandma refused. She insisted the house needed her. She said if she left, it would walk. When my mother told me that phrase, I felt my skin go cold all over again. In the weeks that followed, I tried to reconstruct the event in a way that fit the world. Stress, exhaustion, the smell of mold, the power of suggestion. An intruder who fled, a forgotten relative, a squatter, any human shape that could be held in reason, but the details resisted. The clock stopping at the same moment the lock turned. The way the footsteps had sounded like belonging. The way Grandma had said, without hesitation, "It knows the date. It looks for family. It's getting closer to remembering." I called Grandma once, 3 days after Christmas, when the city was damp and gray and everyone had gone back to work. My mother dialed the number and put the phone on speaker because she didn't trust me not to ask the wrong questions. Grandma answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded normal. That was the first shock. The second was how tired it sounded, as if every word came from a long distance. "Hello," she said. "It's me," I said. My throat tightened immediately. "I'm sorry." There was a pause, the faint crackle of an old line. "You shouldn't have come," Grandma said. "I didn't know." Another pause. I heard a soft sound in the background, wood shifting or a door settling. Grandma continued as if she hadn't heard it. "You weren't meant to be here for this," she said. "But the date pulls." "What is it?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I expected. Grandma inhaled slowly. "A room that remembers," she said. My mother hissed my name under her breath, warning. I ignored it. "Is it him?" I asked. Grandma's silence lasted long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Then she said very quietly, "He stayed where he was told not to stay." My skin prickled. "Is he alive?" Grandma's voice sharpened for the first time. "Don't," she said. "Don't put words on it. Words make it real." I could hear her breathing now, the faint exertion of it. Behind it, there was something else, so soft it could have been the line itself. A thin, wrong little melody, 3 notes that almost formed a Christmas tune, then slipped out of key. I froze. My mouth went dry. "Grandma," I whispered. She exhaled, long and controlled. "It hears you," she said, and then, with the same practical finality she used to end arguments when I was a child, "Goodbye." The line went dead. After that, my mother refused to let me call again. She said Grandma needed rest. She said the village was watching. She said we'd go in the spring and deal with repairs. Spring felt like a different universe. I didn't argue because arguing would mean admitting that there was something to deal with. I tried to sleep in my old childhood room at my mother's place and found that I couldn't. Each time the apartment building settled, my body reacted as if a door were flexing under pressure. Each time a neighbor walked in the hall, my heart jumped. I started leaving lights on. Not all of them. Just enough to break the dark into manageable sections. One night in early January, I woke at 3 in the morning with the smell in my nose. Sweet, damp, wrong. I sat up, sweating, and realized it wasn't in the room. It was in me, lodged in memory so deep my body could summon it without permission. I went into the kitchen and drank water straight from the tap. The city lights outside were steady and indifferent. Cars passed. People lived. The world continued. But when I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's hallway and the back room door at the end, and I felt the same pressure as before, the certainty of being noticed. Christmas came and went, and something in that house moved toward the surface. I don't know what my grandmother did after I left. I don't know if she closed the door again, or if it stayed open. I don't know if the smell ever left the walls. I don't know if the village people who helped that night told themselves a story they could live with and then never mentioned it again. What I do know is what happens to my body every December now, before any decorations go up, before any music plays. There is a moment always when the air shifts and the dates start to line up, and my skin tightens as if expecting a hand on a doorknob. Because some houses don't celebrate Christmas. They mark it. And some doors don't stay shut because they are locked. They stay shut because someone on the other side is waiting for family to come home. Story 3. Tarot at a Christmas party went wrong. Introduction. I was 16, the Christmas it started, old enough to be trusted with a house key, and young enough to think trust meant safety. The week before the break, the air at school had that restless holiday charge. Teachers rushing through lessons, everyone pretending they were focused while their bodies were already somewhere else. People talked about gifts and plans and who was going to whose place, the way teenagers do when they're trying to convince themselves that the world is stable and full. Maya's parents were leaving town for a few days. That was the whole reason the party existed. Not an official invitation, not a flyer, not anything that would look good in hindsight. Just a message thread that grew and grew until it felt inevitable. Christmas party at mine, Maya typed. Friday. Parents gone. Be normal. None of us were normal. We were a tight knot of friends who had known each other long enough to memorize each other's patterns, and that kind of closeness makes you reckless. It makes you believe that if something goes wrong, it will go wrong in a familiar way, like an argument or a broken glass or someone getting sick and everyone laughing too loudly about it afterward. The night of the party, the temperature dropped hard. It wasn't snowing, but the cold had that dry bite that turns your breath into sharp little clouds. I walked to Maya's house with my scarf pulled up to my nose, the streetlights making wet patches on the pavement glow orange. The neighborhood was quiet in a way that felt staged. Neat lawns asleep under frost, windows lit with soft tree lights, the distant hum of televisions behind curtains. It was the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're moving through a set. Maya lived in a 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, one of those places that looks identical to its neighbors, except for small choices. Different paint on the door, different kind of wreath. Her family always decorated early. The front porch had strings of lights wrapped tight around the railing, warm white, steady, not blinking. A plastic reindeer stood by the steps, facing the street like it was on duty. I remember the smell when Maya opened the door. Heat, perfume, and the sharp chemical bite of something sugary, spiked punch probably, mixing with the cold air that rushed in behind me. Music thumped from somewhere upstairs, bass heavy enough to vibrate the hallway floorboards. Someone yelled my name from the living room. Someone else shoved a red cup into my hand without asking if I wanted it. The house was already crowded. Coats piled on the bed in Maya's parents' room. Shoes stacked in awkward rows by the front door, some still wet, leaving dark crescents on the tile. The living room lights were dimmed and someone had draped a strand of colored bulbs across the curtain rod, so the room glowed faintly red and green, like we were inside a cheap holiday display. The smell of cinnamon candles fought with the smell of sweat and perfume and whatever was in the cups. I stayed near the edge at first, the way I always did. I wasn't shy exactly, I just liked watching. Watching felt like control. You could notice who was already drunk, who was pretending not to be, who had come hoping to see someone specific. You could decide when to move in, when to disappear to the kitchen for water, when to step outside for air. There were about 20 of us, maybe more. Some faces I knew only by hallway recognition, people who were friends of friends, the kind who slip into a party and then get remembered afterward only as that guy in the gray hoodie or the girl with the eyeliner. It felt harmless, loud, messy, warm, the kind of night that turns into a story you tell the next week with a smile and a headache. Around 10, the power flickered. Not fully out, not dramatic. Just a quick dimming that made the music stutter for half a second. The colored bulbs over the curtains went dark and then bright again. A few people cheered like it was exciting. Someone laughed too hard. Maya yelled from the kitchen that it always happened when it got cold. The neighborhood grid was old, nothing to worry about. But I felt my stomach tighten. Not fear, more like an instinctive irritation, the way your body reacts to a sound you can't place. The flicker made the room feel thinner for a moment, like the walls had relaxed and then snapped back into place. I went to the kitchen for water and found Maya and 2 girls I didn't know rummaging through a drawer. The drawer was half stuck, scraping against wood as they pulled it open. "What are you doing?" I asked. Maya looked up with that expression she wore when she wanted to look fearless. "We found something," she said. "Like an actual tarot deck, in my mom's junk drawer." One of the girls, Elena, I learned later, held up a worn stack of cards wrapped in a faded cloth. The cloth looked like an old scarf frayed at the edges. The cards themselves were thicker than the glossy ones you buy at bookstores, and the edges were darkened, like they'd been handled so much the paper had absorbed oils and time. "Your mom does tarot?" I asked. Maya shrugged. "No, I've never seen it. It was behind the batteries." Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We should do readings," she said. "It's Christmas. We should do something different." I remember the way she said different, like it was a dare. I should have walked away then. I should have taken my water back to the living room and let the night continue in its predictable chaos. But the flicker had already pried something open in my attention, and the sight of the deck felt like a hook catching under my ribs. People love rituals when they're bored, especially teenagers. We want something to happen, something to mark the night as more than noise. A reading felt like a game, a way to make everyone lean in, a way to touch fear safely. We cleared space on the kitchen table. Someone pushed aside a bowl of chips. Someone else turned the overhead light off and left only the under-cabinet strip light, which cast a pale bluish glow across the wood. The room suddenly felt smaller, the corners deeper. More people drifted in, drawn by the novelty. The music from upstairs was still going, but muffled now through the kitchen walls, like the house was holding it at a distance. Someone lit another candle, vanilla this time, and the flame threw a small trembling shadow against the backsplash. Elena took the deck out of the cloth and began shuffling with practiced hands. That was the first real irregularity, the first detail that didn't fit. She shuffled like someone who knew the cards, not like someone handling a new toy. Her fingers moved confidently, flicking the corners, making a soft, papery whisper that cut through the party noise. "Where did you learn?" someone asked. Elena's shoulders lifted in a small shrug. "My aunt," she said. "It's just cards." Maya sat down first, eager. Elena told her to focus on a question, but Maya only laughed and said, "Tell me if I'm going to die or whatever." Elena didn't laugh. She set 3 cards down in a line. The under-cabinet light made the images look drained of color. I didn't see the whole spread clearly, but I remember one card because it looked wrong in my brain afterward. An image of a door, not ornate, not Gothic, just a plain door in a plain wall, with a thin line of light underneath it. The picture was simple enough to be ordinary, but the longer I looked at it, the more my throat tightened. Elena stared at the cards for a long time without speaking. The party noise felt far away now, like we'd stepped into a bubble. Finally, she said, "This isn't a joke question." Maya rolled her eyes. "It's tarot. It's literally a joke." Elena's gaze stayed on the cards. "You shouldn't open something," she said quietly. People laughed nervously. Someone made a mocking ooh sound. Maya pushed her cup aside and leaned forward, suddenly more interested. What should I not open? She asked. Elena didn't answer. She gathered the cards briskly, her fingers tighter now, and said, "Next." One by one, people sat. Questions were half serious: exams, crushes, family fights. Elena laid down cards and said vague things that could fit anything, and people reacted the way people always do, finding meaning because they wanted meaning. I stayed standing, watching her hands, watching her expression. She was calm on the surface, but there was a tension in the way she held her shoulders, the way her jaw flexed when certain cards appeared. Sometimes she would pause too long, then glance up at the ceiling as if listening for something. Then she'd force herself back to the table and keep going. When it was my turn, I didn't want to sit. Not really. But Maya grabbed my wrist and pulled me down into the chair like it was a joke, and everyone around the table leaned in. "Ask something," Maya said. I stared at the tabletop. The wood grain was scratched, stained by years of family dinners, and there was a tiny sticky patch where someone had spilled soda and not cleaned it properly. The normality of that detail should have grounded me. It didn't. I tried to form a question that sounded safe. "What should I be careful about?" I said. Elena nodded as if that was the right kind of question. She shuffled again, slower. The cards whispered against each other. The candle flame leaned slightly as if the air had moved. She laid down 3 cards. The first thing I noticed was that my skin had gone cold, like the blood had drained from my hands into my arms. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to hide the tremor. Elena's face changed when she saw the first card. Not shock, more like recognition, the way someone looks when they see a familiar bruise. She flipped the second card, then the third, and her mouth tightened. "Okay," Maya said, impatience creeping in. "What is it?" Elena didn't look at Maya. She looked at me, directly, and the kitchen felt suddenly silent, even though I could still hear the party upstairs. "You have something near you," she said. I let out a short laugh because I didn't know what else to do. "Like what?" Elena's gaze dropped to the cards again. "Something that listens," she said, and her voice was low enough that it felt like she was trying not to let the house hear. The hair on my arms rose. "That's creepy," someone said, laughing, but the laugh sounded thin. Elena started to gather the cards, but as she moved, her finger caught on the edge of the first card, and it slid slightly, revealing more of the image. It was the door again. The plain door, the thin line of light beneath it. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. Elena froze. For a moment, her hand hovered above the deck, as if she didn't want to touch it anymore. Then the under-cabinet light flickered. Once, twice. The kitchen dimmed and brightened, the candle flame shuddering with each pulse. Upstairs, the music cut out. Not gradually. Instantly. The sudden silence felt like pressure against my ears. From somewhere in the house, somewhere not in the kitchen, I heard a sound that didn't belong to any of us. A slow, deliberate knock. Not on the front door. Not on the window. A knock from inside the walls, deep and close, as if something had tapped on the wood from the other side. Nobody moved. Then someone laughed, too loud, too forced, and said it was probably the pipes. But I felt, with a certainty that made my mouth go dry, that the knock had answered Elena's words. Like it had been listening, and now it wanted us to know. That's a background. Looking back, the most frightening part is how ordinary everything around the tarot was. It wasn't a candle-lit seance in an abandoned building. It was a suburban kitchen that still smelled faintly of dish soap, with a chipped mug drying on a rack and a refrigerator covered in magnets from vacations Maya's parents took when we were little. Maya's house was the kind of place adults called nice. Neutral paint, clean carpets, a foyer that echoed when you spoke too loudly. Her parents worked stable jobs and had strict rules that were mostly about appearances. No shoes upstairs, no red wine near the couch, no guests past a certain hour. That night, with them gone, it felt like the house was wearing someone else's clothes. The decorations were still up, garland along the banister, a real pine wreath on the pantry door. But the rooms had lost the sense of supervision that usually held everything in place. I'd been to her house 100 times. Sleepovers, study sessions, Random afternoons where we ate cereal straight from the box and complained about teachers. The kitchen had always been the safest room, bright and practical. Even at night, the under-cabinet lights made it feel like a workspace, not a place where anything could hide. That's why the silence after the knock didn't feel like party drama silence. It felt like the house had made a decision. Someone finally turned the music back on upstairs. I heard a phone speaker crackle, then a playlist starting again, the bass returning like nothing had happened. People in the kitchen released their breath and started talking over each other, trying to drown out what we'd just heard. A couple of them drifted away, pretending they were bored. Elena didn't leave. She stood at the table, with the cards pressed flat under her palm, as if she was holding something down. The candle flame had steadied, but the light still looked wrong to me, too sharp on the counter edges, too pale on skin. "Maybe that's enough," Maya said, trying to sound casual. She picked up her cup, took a sip, and made a face like it tasted different now. Elena shook her head once. "If you stop in the middle, it's worse," she said. I stared at her. Worse how? Elena looked past me, toward the hallway, like she was checking if we were alone. "It's like you knocked," she said. "You don't knock and then walk away. Something hears that," Maya snorted, but it didn't land. "It's cardboard," she said. "It's literally pictures." Elena's eyes stayed on the cloth wrapper. "That cloth," she said. "That isn't junk drawer cloth. That's kept." Maya rolled her eyes. "Okay, detective." But her laugh was thin, and she didn't put her hands on the deck again. The truth is, we all liked Elena's confidence at first. Not because we believed in tarot, but because she acted like she had rules. Rules make people feel safer. If someone looks like they know what they're doing, you can pretend you're not taking a risk. Elena began telling us how her aunt read cards, how you were supposed to close a reading when you were done. She said you couldn't just scatter the cards back into the box. She said you had to put them back in order, wrap them, and say something, out loud, so whatever attention you'd drawn would know it was over. "Like what?" someone asked from behind me. Elena hesitated. "Just thanks. That's it." It sounded harmless, polite, like ending a phone call. She took the deck and started arranging the cards into a neat stack. Her fingers moved slower now, as if she was trying not to make mistakes. The kitchen had filled again, people pretending to be amused, leaning in with their cups, taking videos for their stories. The normal teenage noise returned in pieces, whispering, giggling, the snap of a lighter, the dull thump of music through the ceiling. But the house didn't feel normal anymore. I couldn't stop noticing how the hallway looked from the kitchen doorway. The corridor was darker than it should have been, a long strip of shadow leading to the front door. The Christmas lights on the porch leaked in faintly through the side lights, but the center of the hall stayed dim. When someone walked past, their shadow stretched strangely long. And every few minutes the same thought slid into my mind. The knock wasn't at the front door. It wasn't outside. It came from within the structure, like a response from something that already had access. Elena finished stacking the cards and wrapped them in the cloth, folding the fabric with careful corners. She placed the bundle on the table and put both hands over it. "Okay," she said, and her voice was steady but too quiet. "We're done." The under-cabinet light flickered again. A single pulse, like a blink. Then from upstairs, someone shouted. Not a scream, more like surprise. A chair scraping. A quick rush of footsteps across the ceiling. Maya's eyes widened. "What now?" she said, irritation and nervousness tangled together. We all held still, listening. The music had stopped again, but this time it wasn't a clean cut. It faded into a warped, slowed-down distortion for a second before going silent, like the speaker had choked on the sound. I felt my scalp tighten. A door upstairs opened and closed. Another. Then quiet again. Someone came down the stairs too fast, nearly slipping in their socks. It was Jonah, one of Maya's neighbors, the kind of guy who smiled all the time, even when nothing was funny. His face was pale now. He said, looking around us, trying to decide if this was a prank. "Your bathroom light's on. Like the one in your parents' room." Maya frowned. "So?" Jonah swallowed. "We turned it off. Twice. It keeps coming back on." Maya stared at him, then laughed sharply. Okay, and? Jonah shook his head. The switch isn't loose. It's not the switch. Elena's hands tightened over the wrapped deck. Don't go in there, she said. That made Maya's expression harden. Teen pride is fragile. The quickest way to make someone do something is tell them they shouldn't. It's my house, she snapped. She pushed past Jonah and started up the stairs. A few people followed, energized by the idea of drama. I stayed in the kitchen for half a second, frozen between wanting to be away from anything strange and needing to see what was happening so my brain could file it as normal. Elena looked at me as if she expected me to choose correctly. It wants you to look, she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I followed anyway. Upstairs, the hallway carpet muffled footsteps, but I could feel vibration through the floor as people crowded near the master bedroom door. The air up there was warmer, heavier with perfume and sweat. The bathroom light under the door was a bright strip against the darker hall. Maya opened the door and the light flooded out. The master bedroom smelled like laundry detergent and expensive candles. The bed was neatly made despite the coats piled earlier. The bathroom door was open, and the overhead light was fully on, harsh and white, flattening everything. Maya stepped into the bathroom and flipped the switch down. The light went off. Everyone exhaled in unison, some laughing, some complaining about being scared over nothing. Then the light snapped back on. No delay, no flicker, on, full strength. Maya's hand was still on the switch. She stared at it, confused. She flipped it again. Off, on, on. Each time, her action and the light's response didn't match. It wasn't simply stuck. It was like something else was deciding when the room would be lit. The laughter died. Someone behind me whispered, "What the hell?" Maya stepped back, eyes darting around as if looking for a hidden remote, a trick. The mirror above the sink reflected all of us crammed into the doorway, faces pale in the harsh light. In that reflection, the bathroom looked deeper than it was, like the corners were pulled slightly farther away. Then I noticed the smallest thing. The shower curtain, which was half closed, moved. Not a dramatic swish, just a slow, careful shift, an inch along the rod, as if someone had brushed it from inside the tub. My stomach flipped. My skin went hot under my clothes. I stared so hard my eyes watered. The curtain moved again. Maya followed my gaze. Her face tightened. She forced a laugh that sounded like it hurt her throat. "Okay," she said loudly. "Who's in there?" No answer. Jonah, trying to be brave, stepped forward and grabbed the curtain edge. Elena's voice came from behind us, sharp now. "Don't." Jonah pulled anyway. The curtain slid open smoothly. The tub was empty. No person. No feet. No hiding place. Just the glossy white curve of the bathtub and a damp washcloth draped over the edge like someone had used it recently. Maya's parents were out of town. Nobody had showered. The air in the bathroom smelled faintly sweet. The same wrong sweetness. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then very quietly from somewhere below us, downstairs, inside the house, the knock came again. One deliberate tap, like a reminder, and in that instant, the party stopped being a party. It became a room full of teenagers realizing for the first time that fear can exist without a visible source. Milagro first irregularities. After the second knock, nobody said anything for several seconds. It wasn't dramatic silence. It was the kind where everyone is waiting for someone else to decide what this is allowed to be. A joke, a prank, pipes, anything that didn't require a new category. Maya was the first to move. She stepped back into her parents' bedroom and flipped the bathroom light off again, harder this time, like force might convince it to behave. The light stayed off. She looked around, lips tight, and laughed in a way that felt practiced. "Okay," she said. "That's enough. Someone's messing around." Nobody admitted to anything. People started drifting away from the doorway, relief rushing in now that the light had stopped fighting back. Someone suggested shots. Someone else complained they were cold. The spell, whatever it was, thinned just enough for the night to keep going. But it didn't reset. Downstairs, the music came back on, quieter than before. The bass felt muted, like it was being absorbed by the walls. I stayed near the stairs, my body refusing to fully relax. The house felt tilted. Not physically, but in the way your perception tilts when you realize a room has more exits than you thought. Elena stayed close to the kitchen table. She'd tucked the wrapped deck back into the drawer, pushing it behind batteries and a broken tape measure, but she kept glancing at it like she expected it to move. At one point, she took the drawer out completely and put it on the counter instead, as if distance mattered. "Do you smell that?" she asked me quietly. I nodded. The sweetness had grown stronger, but it wasn't constant. It came and went in waves, like someone opening and closing a door somewhere deep in the house. Around 11, people started leaving. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just a gradual thinning, excuses forming easily, parents texting, rides arriving early, headaches. Every time the front door opened, cold air swept in, sharp and grounding, and I found myself watching it longer than necessary, memorizing the way escape looked. Maya noticed. "You okay?" she asked, handing me water. "Yeah," I said automatically. She hesitated. "If you want to crash here, you can." "A bunch of us are." The idea of staying in that house overnight made my stomach clench, but the idea of walking home alone through dark streets felt worse. I nodded. By midnight, there were only 7 of us left. The house felt too big for that few people. Sounds echoed oddly. A laugh from the living room bounced off the hallway walls and came back sounding thinner, stretched. We turned the music off completely. Not because anyone said to, but because it felt wrong to have it on. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was attentive. We sat in the living room with blankets pulled from the closet, Christmas lights blinking softly along the banister. The blinking started to bother me after a while. Not the lights themselves, but the way they never quite blinked at the same rhythm. Red on. Green delayed. Blue flickering slightly longer than it should. Someone joked about telling ghost stories. Nobody actually started one. It was Jonah who broke the quiet. "My phone keeps doing this," he said, holding it up. The screen was on, brightness dimming and brightening on its own. "Low battery?" Maya asked. He shook his head. "It was at 80. Elena leaned forward. "Turn it off." Jonah frowned, but did it. The screen went black. The room felt a fraction darker afterward, like it had lost something reflective. A few minutes later, my own phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a text from my mom. There was no notification. The screen lit anyway. For half a second, I saw my lock screen as normal. Then the image warped, not dramatically, just subtly, like a compression glitch. The photo of my dog stretched slightly, the background blurring. Then the screen went dark. My heart started to beat faster. I powered the phone off completely and slid it face down onto the coffee table. Above us, the house made a sound I'd never noticed before. Not a creak. Not a pop. A long, low, settling noise, as if weight had shifted somewhere high up and stayed there. Maya frowned at the ceiling. "Is someone upstairs?" Nobody answered. We all knew who was left. No one had gone up. No one had reason to. Elena stood. "We should close it," she said. "Close what?" Maya asked, irritation creeping back in. "Fear makes people short." "The reading," Elena said. "We didn't finish. We stopped in the middle," Maya scoffed. "You wrapped the cards. You said thank you. What else do you want?" Elena's hands trembled. "That wasn't for this," she said. "This isn't polite." That was the moment I realized she was scared. Not play-acting scared. Not enjoying it. Genuinely trying to fix something she didn't fully understand. Another sound came from upstairs. This one was clearer. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Not the uneven stumbling of someone drunk. Each step placed deliberately, as if testing the floor before committing weight. They moved from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped. My mouth went dry. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Jonah," Maya whispered. "You're messing with us, right?" Jonah shook his head so fast his glasses slipped. "I swear." The footsteps started again, closer to the stairs. I stood without meaning to. My legs felt wrong, light and shaky, like they didn't fully belong to me. "Elena," I whispered. "Do something." She swallowed hard. "I don't know how." The steps reached the top of the stairs, paused, then began to descend. Each step landed with just enough pressure to make the wood complain softly. Not rushing. Not sneaking. Coming down like it had every right to. The bottom step creaked. And then, nothing. The sound stopped completely, as if whoever was there had decided not to finish the descent. The silence stretched. In that silence, I noticed something else. The front door. The deadbolt handle, which had been vertical all night, slowly turned. Not fast. Not forcefully. Just enough to unlock. Maya made a small, broken sound in her throat. Elena whispered, "It's not here for the house." The deadbolt clicked. The handle didn't move after that. The door stayed shut, but the message was clear. Whatever had been listening since the tarot reading hadn't come in, it had already been inside. The escalating tension. After the deadbolt unlocked itself, no one suggested leaving anymore. Not because we consciously decided to stay, but because the idea of moving through the house felt suddenly complicated, like the layout had changed without telling us. The front door was only 10 steps away from where we stood, but those 10 steps felt longer than the walk home ever had. Maya locked it again. She turned the deadbolt back with both hands, hard enough that the metal clacked loudly. She tried the handle twice after, pulling until her shoulders tensed. "It's locked," she said, more to herself than to us. Nobody responded. We gathered closer together in the living room, not sitting so much as hovering, ready to move if someone else did. The Christmas lights along the banister kept blinking out of sync, and now that I was watching them closely, I noticed something else. Every time the blue bulb near the bottom step went dark, the room felt colder. Not emotionally, physically. Like a draft passed through the space and vanished when the light came back on. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the dry scrape of skin on skin. Elena stood with her back to the wall, arms folded tight across her chest. She kept glancing between the ceiling and the hallway, her eyes tracking something I couldn't see. "It reacts to attention," she said quietly. Maya snapped her head toward her. "Stop saying things like that." Elena flinched but didn't back down. "I'm serious. When we talk about it, when we look for it, it adjusts." As if to underline her words, the grandfather clock in the hallway, which I hadn't even noticed before, gave a sharp, single tick. Just one. Then it went silent again. Jonah swallowed audibly. "That clock's always loud," he said. "I've been here before." Nobody contradicted him. The silence felt thicker than sound. A few minutes passed. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. Time had started doing something strange, stretching and folding in on itself. I remember thinking it felt like waiting for a text reply that never comes. That low-level tension where you can't fully relax because the next vibration might mean something important. Then the smell returned. Stronger than before. Sweet damp, layered with something sour now, like old breath trapped in fabric. It came from the hallway, drifting into the living room in slow pulses. Each time I inhaled, my stomach rolled. Maya gagged softly. "What is that? Elena?" I asked. She shook her head, eyes wide. "It's closer." Before anyone could ask closer to what, the temperature dropped sharply. Not the gradual cooling of a house losing heat. A sudden biting cold that raised goosebumps instantly along my arms. My breath fogged faintly in front of my face. The Christmas lights flickered faster, their rhythm breaking down completely. Red stayed on too long. Green blinked twice in quick succession. Blue went dark and didn't come back. The living room fell into a dim, uneven glow. From upstairs came a sound that made my chest seize. Dragging. Slow, uneven, heavy. Not footsteps this time. Something being pulled across carpet, catching occasionally, then continuing. The sound moved from the far end of the upstairs hallway toward the stairs. Maya let out a sob she didn't seem aware of making. "It's not real," Jonah said, his voice high and brittle. "It's not real." Elena slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. "We didn't finish," she said again, more to herself now. "We opened it, but we didn't close it properly." The dragging stopped at the top of the stairs. The smell intensified, filling the living room so completely it felt like breathing through cloth. My eyes burned. My heart hammered hard enough to make my vision pulse. I took one step backward and bumped into the couch. The contact grounded me just enough to realize my hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Maya," I whispered, Your parents' room. The deck. She shook her head wildly. No. No. We're not going back up there. The first step creaked, not the dragging sound. A footstep. Then another. Slow. Intentional. Whatever was coming down the stairs wasn't rushing anymore. It didn't need to. Each step landed with enough weight to make the wood complain, the sound vibrating through the floor and into my bones. I could feel it through the soles of my feet, a low-frequency pressure that made my teeth buzz faintly. Halfway down, it stopped. The pause felt deliberate, like it was listening to us listen to it. In that silence, my phone, powered off, face down on the coffee table, lit up. The screen glowed white, too bright in the dim room. I stared at it, my throat closing. The screen wasn't showing my lock screen. It was showing text, one line, centered. I don't remember the exact words. What I remember is the certainty that the message wasn't meant for everyone. It was meant for me. The phone went dark again. At the same moment, the weight on the stairs shifted, and whatever had paused began to move again. Closer now, lower. The last thing I felt before panic fully took over was a deep, instinctive understanding settling into my body. The tarot reading hadn't predicted anything. It had introduced us. That critical incident. Nobody suggested calling the police. Even if one of us had thought of it, the idea of explaining why 7 teenagers were in a house full of alcohol with parents out of town felt impossible. The adults we imagined on the other end of the line belonged to a different reality, one with clear reasons and clean sentences. What we had in that living room wasn't clean. It was a pressure in the air and a smell that didn't belong, and a staircase holding weight that refused to show itself. Maya backed toward the hallway wall where the light switch was. Her fingers found it and flipped it up. The ceiling light came on, harsh, yellow-white, and for a second I felt relief so strong it made me dizzy. The room looked normal again. Couch cushions, cups on the coffee table, a throw blanket half on the floor. The banister lights blinked in their usual cheap pattern. We were just kids in a house. Then the ceiling light dimmed slightly, as if something had put a hand over the bulb. Not fully. Just enough to shift every face into a tired, sick color. Maya flipped the switch down and up again. The light brightened, then dimmed. Brightened, then dimmed. Like the circuit was being argued with. "Stop!" Elena said, her voice small. Maya froze with her hand still on the switch. The light held at the dim level as if satisfied. On the stairs, the invisible presence continued. One more step, a long pause, then another. It was closer than it should have been for how little time had passed, as if it wasn't moving through space so much as choosing positions. I couldn't stop thinking about my phone, about the bright white screen and the single line of text I couldn't even repeat in my head without feeling sick. It hadn't been a threat. It had been something worse, a statement that assumed intimacy, like the thing knew which part of me would react. The only way out of that was action, movement, anything that wasn't waiting. "Elena," I said, and my voice cracked on her name. "You said we didn't close it properly. Tell us what to do." "Exactly." Elena looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but not with tears yet. Just that glassy shine of someone fighting not to break. "I need the deck," she whispered. "It's upstairs," Maya said. "In the drawer." Elena shook her head. "Not in the drawer," she said, and that certainty made my stomach drop. "It won't stay where you put it." Another step creaked. This time, the sound came from the bottom third of the staircase. Too close. Too low. Jonah made a choking noise and backed into the corner by the TV, as if being smaller would help. The other two, Lena and Callum, stood with their shoulders pressed together, faces blank with shock. I took one step toward the stairs. My legs felt like they were moving through water. The smell thickened around the stairwell, sweet and sour, like breath trapped under a blanket. Maya grabbed my sleeve. "Don't!" she said, panic sharpening her voice. I didn't look at her. If I looked, I would see fear, and fear spreads faster than anything. I kept my eyes on the stairs. The steps stopped. It felt like it stopped because it noticed my decision. The house held still with it. The kitchen was only a few paces away, and beyond that, the back hallway and the laundry room. I thought absurdly about windows. about climbing out. But the snow outside, the darkness, the neighborhood, the idea of being scattered, alone, felt worse. "We go together," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's, flat and wrong. "We get the deck. We finish it. Then we leave." Elena nodded, but she didn't stand yet. She looked at the stairs and whispered something under her breath that sounded like counting. Maya let go of my sleeve. Her face had gone pale and shiny with sweat. She nodded once, like she didn't trust her mouth. We moved as a group toward the stairs. Each step we took made the banister lights flicker, the blue bulbs struggling to hold. The ceiling light stayed dim, and the shadows along the stairwell looked deeper than physics allowed. At the base of the stairs, the air was colder. My breath showed clearly now. I put my hand on the banister and felt the wood vibrate faintly, like a distant engine running somewhere behind the walls. We climbed. Every instinct screamed against it. Going upward felt like entering the mouth of something. But the fear had a direction now, and direction can pretend to be control. Halfway up, I noticed the smell wasn't coming from upstairs anymore. It was coming from inside the staircase itself, from the space beneath the steps, where there was only drywall and darkness. I kept moving. At the top, the hallway carpet looked flattened in places, as if someone heavy had walked it repeatedly. That detail made my stomach lurch because I didn't remember the carpet being that worn, and yet it wasn't new. It looked like weeks of use, not one night. The master bedroom door was open. The bathroom light was off. Everything looked calm, staged. Maya went first, pushing into her parents' room like anger could shield her. The coats were still piled on the bed, but they looked disturbed, as if someone had rummaged through them. One sleeve hung down toward the floor, pointing at the nightstand. The drawer in the nightstand was open an inch. Elena inhaled sharply. Maya crossed the room in 3 quick steps and yanked the drawer open. The tarot deck was there, not wrapped, not hidden. Just the cards loose, fanned slightly like they'd been handled and set down in a hurry. The faded cloth was folded neatly beside them, too neat, like someone had taken time. Elena reached for the deck, then stopped. Her hand hovered above the cards without touching. "Don't touch them yet," she said. "Not like that." The air in the room felt thicker, as if the walls had moved in a fraction. The smell was strongest here, close enough that it coated my tongue. Elena asked for a flat surface. Maya shoved a stack of magazines off the dresser and cleared a space. The cards made a dull, soft sound as Elena lifted them carefully, like they were heavier than paper. "We're going to do it once," she said, voice low. "No questions. No playing. Just close it." She set the deck down and began to arrange the cards in a stack with both hands, pressing the edges so they aligned. Her fingers trembled. She was breathing through her mouth like the air hurt. Behind us in the hallway, something moved. Not footsteps. A soft brush against carpet, like fabric dragging lightly. Maya stiffened. Jonah's eyes went wide. I kept my gaze on Elena's hands, because if I looked away, I knew I'd see something I couldn't explain. Elena slid the faded cloth under the deck and folded it around the cards. She held the bundle between her palms and closed her eyes. Her lips moved. I heard a whisper, words too quiet to catch, but steady, repeated, like a practiced ending. It sounded less like a spell and more like the way someone talks to a frightened animal. The room grew colder. The surface of the dresser beneath my fingertips felt like ice. My teeth began to chatter, not from panic, but from temperature. Elena opened her eyes. They were glossy now, but still focused. "Now," she said, and her voice was firmer. "We say it together. We're done." "That's it." We looked at her like children being asked to recite something at school. Maya's mouth opened, then closed. Jonah swallowed. The hallway sound paused, as if it was listening for our choice. Elena inhaled. "On 3, she whispered. 1. The ceiling light in the master bedroom flickered. 2. The bathroom door, which had been open, moved slightly inward, just a soft swing, like a draft touched it. 3. We're done, we said, not perfectly in sync, voices overlapping. Elena followed immediately, louder than the rest of us. "Thank you." "Goodbye." For a second, nothing happened. The house held its breath. Then the bundle in Elena's hands grew warm. Not imagined warmth, not the warmth of her palms. A clear heat that made her flinch. She pulled her hands back instinctively, and the cloth-wrapped deck dropped onto the dresser with a soft thud. The smell surged, sharp and sweet, like opening a sealed jar. From somewhere very close, close enough that the sound seemed to come from inside the room rather than the hallway, we heard a quiet inhale, a breath that did not belong to any of us. Maya covered her mouth with both hands. Jonah made a strangled sound. Elena didn't move. She stared at the bundle as if she had expected this, and feared it anyway. The bathroom light snapped on. Full brightness. No flicker. The mirror inside caught the light and threw it out into the bedroom in a hard rectangle. It felt like a spotlight searching. Elena stepped back from the dresser. "Don't look in the mirror," she whispered. It was the most specific instruction she'd given all night, and the specificity made my skin crawl. I tried not to, but my eyes flicked anyway, fast, involuntary. In the mirror, I saw the doorway of the master bedroom behind us and the hallway beyond it. And in that reflected hallway, at the top of the stairs, there was a shape that hadn't been there a moment before. Not a clear person, not a ghostly outline, just a taller darkness against the dim hall, like someone had stepped into the space and absorbed the light. It didn't move. It didn't rush. It simply occupied. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might vomit. I snapped my eyes away. The next sound was not a knock. It was the slow, careful click of the bedroom door moving on its hinges. Maya hadn't touched it. The door swung inward, narrowing the opening to the hallway. Not closing fully. Just enough to change the angle, to make the room feel less connected to the rest of the house. Elena's breathing turned fast, shallow. "It doesn't want us to leave," she said, and her voice finally broke. The doorknob turned. Slowly. The latch clicked. The door moved another inch, as if guided. Callum lunged forward without thinking, and shoved it back open. The wood hit the wall with a dull thud that sounded loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. The hallway was empty, but the cold in it was different, deeper, as if the air itself was heavier there. Jonah whispered. It was right there. Elena grabbed the cloth bundle again, wincing like it burned her. "Downstairs," she said. "Now." We moved, stumbling, not running yet because running would admit what this was. We crowded into the hallway and started toward the stairs. At the top step, the banister lights blinked all at once, then went dark. The house fell into a deeper shadow. The only steady light was the bathroom behind us, bright and white. On the stairs, halfway down, something creaked. Not from our weight. From beneath, inside the structure. A shift, like a body adjusting in a confined space. My skin went cold all over. I grabbed the banister and felt it vibrate again, stronger now, like something inside the house had woken fully. We descended fast, feet slipping slightly on carpet, hands scraping along walls. The living room below looked wrong, too dark, corners too deep, the Christmas tree lights blinking in the corner like a pulse. Maya reached the front door first and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't move. She tried again, harder, shoulder pressed into it. The handle moved a fraction, then stopped, as if held from the other side. "There's no one outside," Maya said, voice cracking. "There's no one." Elena shoved past her and turned the deadbolt. It turned easily. The handle still wouldn't go down. The house wasn't locked. It was refusing. Behind us, from the stairwell, the dragging sound returned, slow, wet, deliberate, coming down without hurry. The smell thickened until it felt like swallowing syrup. Jonah started to cry, not loudly, just a thin, involuntary sound of someone losing control of their breathing. I turned toward the kitchen, toward the back of the house, because the front was closed and the back was unknown. The windows over the sink looked black, reflecting only our pale faces. The back door was there, a rectangle of wood with a small pane of glass. I ran to it and grabbed the handle. It opened. Cold air hit my face like a slap. Snow blew in, sharp and granular, carried by wind. We poured out into the backyard. The yard lights were off. The world beyond the fence was a blur of snow and darkness. Our feet sank into frozen grass and wet patches, slipping. Behind us, in the kitchen window, the under-cabinet light flickered on, then off, then on again, as if the house were blinking. Elena ran beside me, clutching the bundle to her chest. Her breath came in painful gasps. Maya stumbled in the snow and I grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. We reached the side gate. It was usually stiff, swollen with winter moisture. Maya fumbled with the latch. It didn't open. She pulled harder. Metal scraped. The gate held. Not jammed. Held. I looked up at the fence line and felt a wave of dizziness. The tops of the fences seemed higher than they should have been, the boards dark and wet, offering no grip. From inside the house, through the kitchen window, a shadow passed. Not a person. A density. Then the sliding glass door to the patio, which I hadn't even registered, moved. The handle turned. The door slid open a few inches. A line of warm interior light spilled into the snow, a thin, bright cut. We froze in the yard, 7 teenagers suddenly silent, staring at that opening. No one stepped out, but the smell rolled into the cold air, sweet and damp, and my stomach clenched as if the air itself had become contaminated. Elena whispered, "Don't run. It likes that." The sentence made no sense, and yet my body obeyed it. I stood still, shaking, my eyes fixed on the crack of the door. Inside, the light dimmed slightly, like the ceiling bulb had been covered again. Then, from the darkness beyond the doorway, a voice that was not a voice formed a sound. Not words. A rough attempt at our rhythm. Like someone repeating the cadence of a sentence without understanding meaning. My throat tightened until it hurt. I tasted bile. Maya made a small whimper and pressed her face into my shoulder. I held her without thinking. In the distance, beyond the fence, a car engine started. Headlights swept briefly across the snow, moving along the street. The normality of that light was a lifeline. Jonah screamed then, finally, fully, and the sound broke whatever thin rule had been holding the night together. We moved all at once, scrambling, climbing the fence like animals, hands splintering on wet wood, boots slipping, knees scraping. I got over last, hauling myself up and dropping hard onto the other side, pain jolting through my ankles. Elena dropped beside me, still clutching the bundle. Maya fell and cried out, then stood and ran anyway. We didn't stop until we were in the street under a lamp that made the snow look clean and harmless. I turned back. Maya's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, porch lights steady, wreath on the door, Christmas decorations calm and cheerful. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. But I could see the kitchen under-cabinet light through the window. On, off, on, like something inside was still counting, still listening, waiting for us to decide what story we would tell about it. Aftermath, we didn't talk while we ran. Not until we were several streets away, huddled under a streetlight that buzzed faintly and flickered just enough to make every shadow feel suspect. Snow gathered on our hair and coats, melting down our necks. My lungs burned with cold air and panic, each breath coming out in sharp, painful bursts. Someone was crying. I think it was Jonah. Maybe it was more than one of us. I realized my own hands were shaking so badly I had to clench them into fists and press them into my jacket pockets to make it stop. Elena was still holding the bundle. That was the first thing I noticed once the immediate terror dulled enough to let my brain latch onto details. The cloth-wrapped deck was tucked against her chest like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Snow had dusted the fabric, melting into dark spots. "Elena," I said, and my voice sounded hoarse, like I'd screamed even though I hadn't. "We need to get rid of that." She shook her head immediately, too fast. "Not here." "Why not?" Maya snapped. Her teeth were chattering, whether from cold or shock I couldn't tell. "Just throw it away." Elena's eyes flicked back toward the direction of the house, even though we couldn't see it from where we stood. "It's attached now," she said. "You don't just drop something like that and walk away." The way she said attached made my stomach tighten again. We argued quietly, voices breaking, overlapping. Nobody wanted to go back. Nobody wanted to be responsible for whatever came next. In the end, practicality won out in the weakest possible way. Callum's brother lived a few blocks over and he was home. An adult. Someone solid. We went there. Callum rang the doorbell with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. When his brother opened the door, warm light spilling out into the snow, the normalcy of it almost made me collapse. He stared at us, confused, then alarmed, as he took in our faces, our scraped hands, our breathless panic. "What happened?" he asked. Nobody answered right away. How could we? How do you compress what had happened into something that makes sense in a doorway? Party got out of hand. Callum managed finally. "Can we come in?" His brother hesitated, then stepped aside. Yeah, come in." The warmth inside hit me like a wave. My skin prickled painfully as blood rushed back into my fingers. The house smelled like laundry detergent and dinner leftovers. A television murmured from another room. Everything was aggressively normal. We took off our coats and boots in a clumsy pile by the door, snow melting into the mat. I realized then that my jeans were torn at the knee and my hands were streaked with blood from splinters. The sight of it made my stomach flip, not from pain, but from the delayed understanding that my body had been doing things without my permission. Callum's brother brought us water, blankets. He asked again what happened. This time, pieces came out. Not the whole thing. Not the shape in the hallway or the door unlocking itself. Just enough to sound like a bad night. Lights flickering. Someone messing with the breaker. A prank that went too far. A panic spiral. Elena didn't say anything. She sat on the edge of the couch, clutching the bundle in her lap, eyes unfocused. After a while, parents were called. Rides were arranged. Excuses were practiced. The night was slowly, forcibly returned to something that could be explained. My mom arrived just before 2. She hugged me too tightly and scolded me too softly, her fear leaking through the cracks of her anger. On the drive home, the car heater blasting, she kept glancing at me like she expected me to disappear. I didn't tell her the truth. Not that night. Not ever. At home, I showered until the hot water ran out, trying to scrub the smell from my skin. It lingered anyway, faint but persistent, like it had sunk beneath the surface. When I lay in bed, the darkness pressed close, and every small sound, the house settling, a car passing, made my muscles tense. I didn't sleep. In the morning, my phone was full of messages. Group chats exploding with half-formed questions, frantic reassurances, jokes that didn't land. Someone said Maya's parents were coming home early. Someone else said the police had been by because of noise complaints. The explanations multiplied, layered over each other, until the truth was buried under volume. Maya didn't go to school the next week. Neither did Jonah. Elena came back after 2 days, pale and quiet. The bundle was gone. I cornered her in the hallway between classes, my heart hammering like I was back in that house. "What did you do with it?" She looked around, then leaned closer. "I didn't get rid of it," she said. "I returned it." "To who?" She swallowed. "To where it came from." The answer didn't help. Over the next few weeks, strange things followed us, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Maya said her bathroom light turned on by itself at night, even after an electrician came and found nothing wrong. Jonah stopped sleeping in his room because he heard someone pacing outside his door, always stopping just before the handle turned. Callum's dog refused to go into the basement anymore, whining and bracing its paws against the floor. As for me, my phone never behaved the same way again. It would light up randomly, brightness shifting without input, screens glitching for half a second before returning to normal. I stopped leaving it on my nightstand. I started turning it face down, powered off, like that might matter. Christmas came and went, the decorations taken down, the streets returning to their usual gray. Life resumed its shape. Homework, exams, plans for the future. But something had shifted. Every once in a while, when I was alone, I would catch the smell again. Sweet. Damp. Wrong. It would appear without warning, linger just long enough to make my pulse spike, then fade. No source. No explanation. I learned to live with it the way you learn to live with a scar, by pretending it's not there until something brushes against it. I never went back to Maya's house. Last I heard, her parents sold it the following summer. They told people it was for work, for convenience. The house stayed empty for months before someone new moved in. The Christmas lights didn't come back that year. Sometimes, late at night, when December creeps close again and the air gets sharp and dry, I think about that first knock. The one that came from inside the walls. I think about Elena's words. It wasn't a prediction. It was an introduction.